She went on a blind date and almost never made it home. Avery Sinclair ran a billion-dollar empire and thought she could read anyone in 30 seconds flat. She thought that night would be another forgettable failure, another overprivileged man in an expensive suit talking about himself across a candlelit table. She almost didn't go. She almost canceled 3 times. But she went. And the quiet carpenter sitting across from her, the one with sawdust still caught in the creases of his jacket, and a 7-year-old boy drawing on a napkin beside him. He was about to save her life. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The conference had run 40 minutes over schedule, the way conferences always did when the keynote speaker confused length with depth. And by the time Avery Sinclair stepped out of the Blackridge Summit Hotel's main ballroom and into the polished corridor beyond it, her heels were killing her, and her patients had already filed for divorce. She pulled out her phone without breaking stride. 14 unread emails. 3 missed calls from her VP of Operations. 1 text from her assistant, Priya, that read, "Don't cancel. You promised. Room 4, Ember Lounge, 7 p.m. His name is Cole. I'm begging you." Avery stopped walking. She read the text again, then she typed back, "Define begging." Priya's response came in under 4 seconds. "I will personally drive to that mountain and drag you there myself. You have been working 16-hour days for 11 months. You haven't been on a date since the Garrett situation. You need this." Avery hated that Priya had brought up the Garrett situation. She also hated that Priya was right. She stood in the corridor for a moment, letting the noise from the ballroom bleed through the closed doors behind her. Applause for something, probably nothing. And she looked at herself in the floor-length mirror beside the coat check. 30 years old, sharp jaw, dark circles she'd gotten good at hiding, a burgundy dress she'd chosen that morning in approximately 90 seconds because she had a product roadmap review at 8 and a call with the Singapore office at 10 and approximately 0 minutes to think about what she was wearing. She looked tired. Not just tonight tired. Somewhere deeper tired. She put her phone in her clutch and walked toward the Ember Lounge. The Blackridge Summit Resort sat at 4,200 feet above sea level in the Colorado Rockies, which was the kind of detail that ended up in travel magazine headlines, and meant very little to Avery except that the air was thinner up here and her wine hit faster. The resort had been selected for the Tech Forward Summit because it was scenic and remote and the kind of place where the Wi-Fi was intentionally unreliable so that executives would be forced to network in person instead of refreshing their inboxes. Avery had found a way to route her emails through the resort's administrative server on day 1. She was not proud of this. She was also not sorry. The Ember Lounge was at the far east end of the resort's main building, separated from the conference wing by a long corridor lined with black and white photographs of the mountains in winter. The lounge itself was warm in the way expensive places knew how to be. Low amber lighting, a stone fireplace along the back wall, leather chairs and dark wood tables, and the quiet sound of something jazzy playing from speakers hidden somewhere she couldn't identify. The kind of place designed to make you feel relaxed, even if you weren't. Avery paused at the entrance and scanned the room. She was looking for a man in a suit. Someone mid-30s, probably, with the particular brand of confidence that came from having money and knowing it. She'd been on enough of these setups through Priya's well-meaning interference to have a template, venture capital or corporate law, or once, a professional poker player who had spent the entire dinner explaining variance to her as though she hadn't built a statistical modeling algorithm at 24. She was not looking for a man in a flannel shirt, but there he was. Table 4 near the fireplace. Dark flannel, rolled to the elbows. Dark hair that needed cutting by maybe 3 weeks. A jaw that could have been cut from the same stone as the fireplace behind him. He was leaning slightly forward over the table, not looking at his phone, not scanning the room for her the way people usually did when they were nervous about being seen. He was looking down, and when Avery followed his gaze, she saw why. Sitting in the chair beside him, small legs dangling well above the floor, was a boy. 7 years old, maybe. Dark hair like his father's, wearing a green hoodie with a dinosaur on the front that had seen better days. He had a paper napkin spread flat on the table, and he was drawing on it with a stubby crayon he must have gotten from somewhere. A restaurant crayon, the waxy kind that comes in a tiny paper sleeve. He was drawing something with great concentration and total commitment, his tongue just barely visible at the corner of his mouth. Avery stood at the entrance to the Ember Lounge and stared. Then she took out her phone and called Priya. "There is a child," she said when Priya picked up. "Mason," Priya said. "He's 7. Cole's babysitter canceled last minute. I told him it was fine." "You told him it was fine?" "He's a single dad, Avery. His options were cancel or bring the kid. I thought cancel would be worse." "Priya, he's a perfectly nice man. Just go sit down. He's wearing flannel." There was a pause. "Avery, I will remind you that you own 2 flannel shirts yourself and wear them on weekends when you think no one's watching." Avery ended the call. She stood there for another 2 seconds. The boy, Mason, had looked up from his napkin drawing and was now looking directly at her with the particular fearlessness of small children who haven't yet learned to pretend they aren't staring. He had his father's dark eyes. He raised one hand and waved at her with complete sincerity. Avery, against her better judgment, waved back. Then she walked to table 4. Cole Maddox stood when she approached, which she hadn't expected, and extended his hand, which was calloused in a way that no amount of desk work ever produced. "Avery," he said. Not a question. He'd recognized her somehow, or maybe he'd just guessed right. "Cole," she said. His handshake was firm without performing firmness, which was rarer than it should have been. He was taller standing than she'd clocked from across the room, 6'1", maybe 6'2", and he held himself in the particular way of someone who'd spent a long time learning not to take up more space than necessary, not shrinking, just contained. "This is Mason," he said, and the boy looked up from his napkin. "I'm drawing a T-Rex," Mason announced, with the directness of someone who believes the most important thing happening in any room is whatever they're currently doing. "It's fighting a helicopter." "Who's winning?" Avery asked before she could stop herself. Mason considered this seriously. "The helicopter," he said, "because it can fly away." "Smart helicopter," Avery said. Mason nodded like she'd given the correct answer and went back to his drawing. Avery sat down. Cole sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the fire in the hearth made a soft sound behind him, and the jazz played from its invisible speakers, and Avery thought, "This is already the strangest date I've ever been on, and I once went on a date where the man brought his emotional support ferret." "Priya didn't tell me what you do," Cole said. "She didn't?" "She said you were smart and driven and had a bad habit of working on vacations. She said I shouldn't be intimidated." He said this without irony, just stated it plainly. "She said you'd probably check your phone 3 times in the first 10 minutes. Avery became very aware of the phone in her clutch. "What did she tell you about yourself?" she asked. Something almost like a smile. "That I was reliable and patient and had a kid, and that I shouldn't be surprised if you were late." "I wasn't late." "You were 4 minutes late." "The conference ran over." "I know. I heard the speaker from the corridor." He paused. He didn't know what he was talking about. Avery blinked. "You were at the Tech Forward Summit?" "No, I was walking Mason to the bathroom and I passed the ballroom." A beat. He was talking about disruption like it's a personality trait. It's not a strategy. It's just a description of what happens when someone builds something people actually need. Avery stared at him. "Sorry," he said. "That was probably a lot for the first 2 minutes." "No," she said slowly. "No, that was more interesting than anything said inside the ballroom." He looked at her for a moment like he was trying to determine whether she meant it. Then he picked up his menu. "What are you drinking?" he asked. "What?" Cole Maddox, it turned out, was a carpenter. Not a contractor. Not a construction company owner or a real estate developer who called himself a builder because he signed the permits. He was a carpenter, custom furniture, mostly, some residential renovation work, some cabinetry. He'd moved to Durango, Colorado 3 years ago, bought a small house with a workshop attached, and built a business from scratch with his hands and a reputation for doing what he said he'd do on time. "How did you end up in Durango?" Avery asked. "It was the right size," he said. "Not too small that Mason would be bored. Not so big that everything moved too fast." He looked at his son, who had switched from the T-Rex to what appeared to be a volcano. He needed something stable, And before Durango? A slight pause, brief enough that she almost didn't catch it. Different places, he said. I moved around a lot. Military? She guessed. Something about the posture, the economy of movement. He looked at her. What makes you say that? You hold yourself like someone who spent time being evaluated on how they hold themselves. He was quiet for a second. Then, Navy, before Mason. He said it the way people say things they've decided are factual rather than significant. It was a long time ago. She waited for more. He didn't offer any. Navy, she noted, and filed it away. She wanted to ask what he'd done in the Navy because there was something in the pause, in the careful neutrality of it was a long time ago, that suggested the answer was more complicated than he was letting on. But he changed the subject by asking about her work, and she'd let him because she was better at talking about Sinclair Tech than she was at sitting in silences she didn't control. She told him about the company, about building the first version of the platform in her apartment at 23 with a laptop and a borrowed server rack, and a business partner who'd eventually bought her out and moved to Portugal, which she still thought was the best outcome for both of them. About the fundraising rounds and the scaling problems, and the year they'd almost gone under because of a vendor contract she hadn't read carefully enough, and how that year had made her a better CEO than any of the good years had. Cole listened. That was the thing she noticed first and then kept noticing. He actually listened, not in the performative way where someone nods and waits for their turn to speak, but in the way where he was genuinely tracking what she said, filing it, occasionally asking a question that proved he'd been paying attention. The vendor contract, he said at one point. What was the clause you missed? Exclusivity window on the data processing integration, she said. 18 months. We'd already built 3 features on top of it by the time we caught it. He nodded slowly. So you had to rebuild the features or renegotiate the contract? Both. The renegotiation took 4 months and cost us a board member who thought we were too exposed. The rebuild took 8 months and cost us 2 senior engineers who decided they didn't want to redo work they'd already done. She paused. I read every contract myself now, every word. My legal team thinks I'm obsessive. They're probably right, he said, but they're also probably grateful. She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh. It came out genuine instead of polished, which wasn't something she normally allowed in professional adjacent settings, and this was professional adjacent, wasn't it? A networking event? A favor to Priya? She looked at Cole across the candlelit table and thought, when did I stop thinking of this as a networking event? Well, Mason had finished the volcano and moved on to what he'd announced was a submarine battle. He had asked the waiter for another napkin, and the waiter had brought him 3, plus a small bowl of crackers that Mason had accepted with a very formal, "Thank you, sir," that had made the waiter blink in surprise. He always says that? Avery asked after the waiter left. We worked on it, Cole said. There was something quiet and careful in the way he watched his son. Not anxious, he wasn't one of those hovering parents who couldn't look away. But present. Like part of him was always tracking, always aware of exactly where Mason was. He went through a phase where he said nothing to strangers, just stared. Which is fine, that's allowed, but restaurants were getting complicated. How did you get him to come around? Told him that every time he said thank you to someone in a service job, he was treating them like they were worth noticing, and that people who are worth noticing deserve to hear it. He shrugged. He took to it fast after that. Now sometimes I have to ask him to please stop having entire conversations with the checkout person at the hardware store because we have somewhere to be. Avery watched Mason arrange his submarine battle across 3 napkins with great tactical seriousness. He seems like a good kid, she said. He's the best person I know, Cole said simply. Not the best kid, the best person. Avery filed that away too. The dinner itself was good. The resort's kitchen did something with elk medallions that Avery would have paid attention to if she hadn't been half distracted. The distraction came partly from the conversation, which kept being more interesting than she expected, and partly from her phone, which kept pulling at her attention like a bad habit. She checked it twice. She'd meant to do it discreetly, but when she looked up from the second time, Cole was watching her with an expression that wasn't judgment exactly, more like, there it is. Sorry, she said. You don't have to apologize, he said. It's your job. It's a bad habit, she said, which was closer to the truth. Also true, he agreed. Mason looked up from his napkins. My dad puts his phone in his truck when we're at dinner, he informed Avery. He says if it's not an emergency, it can wait, and if it is an emergency, someone will come find you. That's a very extreme position, Avery told him. Mason nodded gravely. He's very extreme sometimes. Cole looked at his son. Finish your salmon. I'm almost done. A pause. The submarine is almost done, too. Avery put her phone face down on the table. Cole noticed. He didn't make a thing of it. No comment, no smile that said, see, that wasn't so hard. He just picked up the thread of what they'd been talking about before she'd checked it. Something about supply chain problems and the difference between building a product and building a company, and they went back to talking like the interruption hadn't happened. She left the phone face down for the rest of dinner. By the time the plates were cleared and Mason had arranged his napkin drawings into a neat stack that he folded carefully and put in the front pocket of his hoodie, for safekeeping, he explained, the fire had burned lower and the lounge had thinned out some. The conference crowd was mostly gone. The people left were the ones who'd come to actually use the bar. Avery sat back in her chair and looked at Cole. She was trying to figure out what she thought of him, and the problem was that she kept updating her assessment. The first version, carpenter, flannel, charming in a low-key way, probably interesting for about 45 minutes, had been revised around the time he'd said that thing about disruption in the hallway. Revised again when she'd watched him with Mason. Revised again somewhere during the conversation about the vendor contract, when he'd asked the exact right question. She still couldn't place him, and she was good at placing people. You're trying to figure me out, he said. I'm always trying to figure people out, she said. Occupational hazard. What have you got so far? She considered the honest answer. You're smarter than you let on. You moved to Durango for specific reasons you didn't fully explain. You were in the Navy and you don't want to talk about what you did there. You're a good father, and you checked the exits when we sat down. Cole went very still. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but Avery caught things. You looked at the main entrance first, she said, then the side door by the coat check, then the corridor that goes toward the kitchen. You did it all in maybe 4 seconds, and you never looked obvious about it. A beat of silence. Old habit, he said. From the Navy? From being careful. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching, without the particular discomfort of someone who's been caught doing something embarrassing. He looked like a man who'd been assessed before and had learned to let it happen. Okay, she said finally. Okay, he said. Mason had fallen asleep in his chair, head tipped against the armrest, his folded napkins clutched in one hand. It had happened at some point in the last half hour without either of them noticing. A child's ability to simply decide without negotiation that it was time to sleep. Cole looked at his son. Something moved across his face. Not sentimentality, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated. I should get him to bed, he said. Of course. He stood and carefully lifted Mason without waking him. The easy, practiced lift of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Mason stirred slightly, made a small sound, pressed his face against his father's shoulder, and went back to sleep without fully surfacing. Cole adjusted his grip. Mason's folded napkins fell from his fingers to the floor. Avery picked them up. She held them for a moment. 3 napkins, covered in crayon. A T-Rex. A helicopter. A submarine battle with what appeared to be sharks involved on the left flank. She set them on the table where Mason could see them if he woke. Avery. She looked up. Cole was watching her. I had a good time, he said. He said it without embellishment, like a fact. She thought about the honest answer again. I did too, she said. I wasn't expecting to. Neither was I. She smiled. He didn't push it further, didn't ask for her number right there, or suggest a follow-up, just gave her a nod that managed to be both goodbye and something else she couldn't quite name, and then he turned and walked out of the Ember Lounge with his sleeping son against his chest. Avery sat at table 4 for another minute. She picked up her phone. 14 unread emails had become 22. The call with Singapore was in 3 hours. She put the phone back down. She sat there in the amber light and thought about a man who checked exits without being obvious about it. About a carpenter with calloused hands who'd said the most precise thing she'd heard all week inside a technology conference. About a boy who said thank you, sir, to waiters and kept his drawings for safekeeping. Different places, he'd said. I moved around a lot. She thought about the pause that had come before it. Outside, through the lounge's tall windows, she could see the snow had started coming down, light and steady. The way Colorado mountain snow came in December, blurring the edges of the resort's outdoor lights into soft halos. The parking lot beyond the entrance was quiet, a few staff moving between buildings, the distant tree line dark against the white sky. She was reaching for her coat when she heard the first scream. Tim. It came from the lobby, sharp, cut off, the kind of sound that the body registers before the brain does. Avery stood, instinctively, and the next sound was different. The systematic crash of doors being forced open, multiple points, and then a voice over some kind of amplification that shouldn't have existed inside a resort lobby, but clearly did. Nobody moves. Everyone on the floor. Now. The Ember Lounge's remaining patrons looked at each other with the frozen uncertainty of people whose minds were still negotiating between this can't be real and this is absolutely real. The bartender dropped behind the bar. Two women near the window grabbed each other's arms. Avery's brain came online very fast. It was something she'd always had, the ability to process fast when things went sideways, which was why she was good in a crisis boardroom and why she'd managed not to panic during the vendor contract catastrophe, and why she was now, in the span of about 2 seconds, running through what she knew. Multiple entry points, coordinated, amplified commands, which meant planning. The scream from the lobby had sounded female and terrified, which meant the first thing they'd done was establish fear. They're organized, she thought. This isn't random. She was already moving toward the side corridor, the one by the coat check, the one she hadn't thought about until she'd watched Cole clock it 40 minutes ago. When the lounge's main entrance came open and two men came through it, armed, not resort security, not police. These were men with tactical gear under civilian jackets, faces partially covered, moving with the compact efficiency of people who had practiced this exact thing. The first one swept the room. The second one was looking at something in his hand, a phone or a tablet, and then he looked up and his eyes found Avery. He said something to the first one, too low to hear. But the first one's head turned immediately. They're looking for someone, she thought. And then, in a cold and clarifying moment, they're looking for me. She didn't know how she knew. Maybe it was the way both of them oriented to her simultaneously, the way you orient to a target rather than a threat. Maybe it was the tablet. Someone had given them a face to find. Maybe it was the fact that Avery Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Tech, had been on 2 panel discussions at this conference, and her photograph had been in the program guide and on the event website and in the press coverage that had run in 3 tech publications in the past month. She was already in the side corridor when she heard one of them say, "There, the woman in the red dress." She ran. Omkämmt. The corridor toward the coat check was narrow and dim compared to the lounge, and her heels were a catastrophic choice for this particular situation, which she registered and dismissed simultaneously because the geometry of the building mattered more right now than her footwear. She'd come in through the main entrance, which was compromised. The kitchen corridor was 40 feet ahead on the left. Beyond that, she had no information, which was a problem. She hit the push bar on the side exit door at full speed. The cold hit her first. A wall of December mountain air, shocking and immediate, the snow coming down steadily. She'd come out on the north side of the building, between the main lodge and what looked like an equipment outbuilding, and the light here was minimal. One security lamp on the outbuilding wall casting a pale circle on the snow, the rest darkness. She heard the door behind her open before it had closed all the way. She ran along the building's wall, heels punching through the thin crust of snow with every step, and turned the corner, and ran directly into Cole Maddox. She hit his chest and he caught her. Both hands, instinctive, a grip that was firm and stable and oriented immediately to the sound of the door behind her without looking at her face first. His eyes went to the corner she'd just come around. His body shifted, angled, and Mason was gone. And then she saw the boy pressed against the building wall 6 feet away, absolutely still, watching his father with an expression that was terrified but not panicking, a child who had been told to stay and had stayed. "How many?" Cole said. His voice was low and completely level. "I saw 2 inside," Avery said. Her voice was not level. "There were more in the lobby. I don't know how many total." Cole looked at her for exactly 1 second. Something crossed his face. Not fear, not exactly. Something she didn't have a word for yet. "Stay close," he said. "I have no intention of doing anything else," she said. He moved to Mason and crouched to his son's eye level. "Buddy," he said, quiet and steady, "change of plans. You're going to get on my back and hold on, okay? Whatever happens, you don't let go and you don't make noise." Mason nodded once. His face was white, but his jaw was set. "You're scared," Cole said. "Not a question." "Yes," Mason said. "Good," Cole said. "Scared means you're paying attention. You ready?" "Yes," Mason said again, and climbed onto his father's back. Cole straightened. He had Mason's small arms locked around his neck, and he turned to Avery with the same economy of movement he'd had all evening, except that something had come into his body that hadn't been there before. Something that made the careful, contained man she'd had dinner with feel like a shell around something else entirely. The side door burst open. Cole moved. What happened in the next 12 seconds, Avery would spend a long time trying to reconstruct. She knew it happened very fast. She knew that the first man through the door had a weapon raised and that Cole covered the distance between them in a way that didn't look like running. It was something else, something lower and more direct. And the weapon was gone from the man's hands before he'd processed that anyone was moving toward him. She heard the crack of something breaking. She heard a sound that was not a scream, but was adjacent to one. The second man came out of the door, and Cole had the first man's weapon, and the second man stopped. "On your knees," Cole said. His voice was the same volume it had been all dinner. The second man dropped to his knees. Cole looked at Avery. "We need to move now," he said. "Into the trees. There will be more." Avery looked at the man on his knees in the snow and the other man she couldn't fully see on the ground, and Cole standing there with Mason on his back and a confiscated weapon in his hand as naturally as if he'd been holding it his whole life, and she thought, "Who are you?" She thought it. She didn't say it. She moved. The tree line was 60 yards from the north face of the building, across open ground that felt like a mile with the snow and the darkness and the sounds coming from inside the lodge. Commands, something breaking, the high distressed sound of people under extreme stress. Cole ran with Mason on his back and Avery beside him, and he was faster than she expected, even carrying his son, and she was pushing hard on heels that were destroying her feet, and she didn't care. They hit the tree line. The forest swallowed them immediately. Douglas fir, dense and dark, the snow muffled here under the canopy, the sounds from the resort dropping away to something distant and slightly unreal. Cole kept moving for another 30 seconds, putting more trees between them and the building, then stopped at the base of a large fir and turned. His breathing was elevated but controlled. Avery was gasping. Mason, on his father's back, had not made a sound. Cole set Mason down gently and turned to check behind them. Nothing visible through the trees. He looked at Avery. "You're hurt," he said. She looked down. She'd turned her ankle at some point. She hadn't registered it, but she was right, and now that she was stopped, it was making itself known with considerable enthusiasm. "I'm fine," she said. "Okay," he said. He didn't argue with her, which she noted. He looked at her shoes. "Can you move in those?" "I'll manage." "You don't have to manage. I need to know if they're a problem." She reached down, pulled both heels off, and threw them into the dark trees behind her. He looked at her feet in snow-covered stockings and then back at her face. "That works," he said. "Who are those people?" she demanded. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "What is happening?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but they were looking for you specifically." "How do you know?" "Because they came through the side exit when you did. The lobby team was for crowd control. Those two were for acquisition. He said it in the flat, particular way of someone describing a problem rather than experiencing one. Someone planned this in advance. They knew you'd be at this resort. Why would anyone? She started, and then she stopped because her mind was already running the list. Sinclair Tech had been in acquisition talks with 2 different firms. There were 3 active litigation cases. There was the government contract bid that 2 competitors had protested. There was the cybersecurity patent dispute that had gotten ugly in November. Do you have enemies? Cole asked. I have a successful company, she said. It's basically the same thing. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. We need to get away from the immediate area, he said, and find somewhere defensible while I figure out the perimeter. Figure out the perimeter, she repeated. Cole. Yeah. What did you do in the Navy? He looked at her. The snow was coming down through the breaks in the canopy above them, soft and entirely indifferent to the situation. Later, he said. That's not nothing, she said. No, he said. It's not nothing. Later. Mason tugged once on his father's sleeve. Cole looked down. Dad, Mason said quietly. His voice was small but not shaking. I'm cold. Cole put his hand on his son's head, one brief, deliberate press. I know, buddy, he said. We're going to fix that right now. He looked up into the trees, oriented himself to something Avery couldn't identify. The slope of the land, maybe, or landmarks in the dark that meant something to him, and started moving north. Stay close, he said. Avery stayed close. Behind them, through the trees and the snow, the lights of the Black Ridge Summit Resort glowed amber and faint against the winter sky, and somewhere inside them, men with tactical gear and a photograph of a woman in a red dress were trying to figure out where she'd gone. The forest at 4,200 feet in December was not a place that forgave mistakes. Avery learned this within the first 4 minutes of moving through it barefoot in stockings that had already soaked through completely, the snow coming up over her ankles with every step, and the cold working its way into her feet with a thoroughness that started as discomfort and was escalating steadily towards something more serious. The trees were dense enough to block most of the wind, but not the temperature, and the temperature was somewhere in the low 20s and dropping. She kept moving because Cole was moving, and because stopping felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. Cole moved through the trees the way people move through spaces they'd learned, not with the flashy confidence of someone performing competence, but with the quiet, directed certainty of someone who had been trained to read terrain the way other people read text. He wasn't running. It was faster than walking, some efficient middle gear that covered ground without burning everything he had. And he kept Mason close, the boy moving alongside him now rather than on his back, Cole's hand on his son's shoulder guiding him over roots and through the gaps between trees without breaking stride. Avery's feet had moved past pain into something that felt almost like numbness, which she understood was not an improvement. How far? She said. 10 minutes, Cole said. Maybe 12. To what? Ski patrol cabin. Seasonal. Should be empty. Should be, she said. Should be, he confirmed, without apology for the uncertainty. She pushed a branch aside, and it released a small cascade of snow onto her shoulder. Behind them, she'd have been listening since they entered the trees. She could hear nothing that suggested pursuit. No crashing through underbrush. No voices. Either the men from the resort hadn't followed them into the forest yet, or they were better at moving through it than she'd expect, which was its own kind of bad news. Cole. Yeah. The 2 men at the side door. She kept her voice low out of instinct. Are they... Did you... They're alive, he said. He said it before she finished asking, like he'd been waiting for the question. Incapacitated. They'll be conscious in a few minutes, if they're not already. She processed that. How did you do that so fast? A beat of silence. Just the sound of their feet in the snow and the wind moving through the upper branches. Practice, he said. That's not an answer. It's the answer I've got right now, he said. Keep moving. She wanted to push. She didn't, because he was right, and because her feet were going numb, and the trees around them were getting denser, and she needed to focus on not turning an ankle on a route she couldn't see in the dark. But she filed it. Practice. Alongside different places. and it was a long time ago, and the way he'd moved across 12 feet of distance and disarmed a man with a raised weapon before the man had processed that he was coming. Mason stumbled on something, a root or a rock hidden under the snow, and Cole caught him by the collar of his hoodie without looking, a reflex so automatic it wasn't even a decision. Mason righted himself and kept going. He still hadn't made any sound beyond what was necessary. Avery watched him and thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old could move through a dark forest in the cold and snow after watching his father take 2 armed men apart in the space of a breath and hold himself together this well. She wondered if this wasn't entirely the first frightening thing that had ever required Mason Maddox to hold himself together. She kept the thought to herself and kept moving. The cabin appeared through the trees as a dark shape first, a square mass of shadow against the slightly lighter gray of the snow, and then resolved into a small structure as they got closer. Single story, rough-hewn log walls under a low roof heavy with accumulated snow. A covered porch along the front with 2 wooden chairs that had been pushed back against the wall for winter storage. A door with a simple hasp and a padlock that Cole looked at for approximately 2 seconds before he did something with the hasp itself, not the lock, the hasp, the screws that held it to the wood, and the door opened. Avery stared. The screws were already loose, he said, which may or may not have been entirely true. She decided not to examine it and went inside. The cabin's interior was small and utilitarian in the way of structures built for function rather than comfort. Maybe 20 feet by 15, a wood stove in the corner with a stack of split logs beside it, a metal shelf with emergency supplies in orange-labeled bins, 2 folding cots with rolled sleeping bags, a first aid kit mounted to the wall, a hand-crank radio on the shelf next to the supply bins, a wooden table with 2 chairs. It smelled like cold and pine and something faintly mechanical. No power, but Cole found a headlamp in the first orange bin he opened and clicked it on, keeping the beam low and angled away from the window. "Close the door," he said, and Avery pulled it shut behind her. The cold was still there, but the wind was gone, which made an immediate difference. Cole was already crouching in front of the wood stove, opening it, checking the flue. He found matches and a tin on the shelf and got a fire started with the efficiency of someone for whom fire-making was a practical skill rather than a camping experience. It took him under 2 minutes to have something real going in the stove, and the warmth began reaching outward almost immediately. Mason had sat down on one of the cots without being told. He was hugging his knees to his chest, watching his father work, and his face in the headlamp's indirect glow was tired and pale and still wearing that expression of concentrated not panicking that Avery had been watching since the side exit door. Cole came to him first, before anything else. He crouched in front of his son and took Mason's hands in both of his and rubbed them, slow and firm. "Talk to me," Cole said. "I'm okay," Mason said. "I know you're okay. Talk to me anyway." Mason looked at his father for a moment. "Are those men going to find us?" "I don't know," Cole said. He didn't dress it up. "I'm going to work on making sure they don't. But I'm not going to tell you definitely no when I don't know definitely no." Mason nodded slowly. "Is Avery okay?" Cole looked over his shoulder at Avery, who was standing near the wood stove with her arms wrapped around herself, her ruined stockings soaking through to the floorboards. "She's standing up," Cole said, "which is a good sign." "I'm fine," Avery said, which was mostly true except for her feet, which had resumed feeling things after the warmth hit them, and what they were currently feeling was not pleasant. Cole looked at her feet. "Sit down," he said. Sit down, Avery." She sat down on the other cot, more because the feeling coming back into her feet had hit a particular frequency that was making it hard to stand than because she'd been told to. Cole went to the first aid kit, found a pair of foil emergency blankets, and handed one to Mason and brought the other to Avery. Then he went back to the supply shelf and came back with a pair of wool socks still in their packaging, the kind of industrial wool socks that Ski Patrol kept on hand for the same reason they kept everything else on hand, because mountains produced emergencies, and emergencies produced people who needed wool socks. He crouched in front of her and started to open the packaging. "I can do that," she said. "I know you can," he said, and kept doing it himself. She let him. partly because her hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline come-down, and partly because she was watching his face while he worked and trying to understand the architecture of this man she'd sat across a dinner table from for 2 hours thinking she had roughly figured out. He pulled the first sock on carefully over her foot. She hissed involuntarily. Frostbite? Not yet, but close. The numbness went away when the heat hit. Yeah. He pulled the sock up. That's the lucky version. He started on the second foot. You'll have some pain for a bit. If it blisters, we'll deal with it. It won't blister, she said. Probably not. A pause. You did well out there. She looked at him. I ran through the woods in heels. Then I threw the heels away and ran through the woods in stockings. You didn't panic, he said. You assessed the threat. You moved toward the exit I clocked during dinner, and you didn't make noise when noise would have gotten us caught. That's not nothing. She felt something strange happen in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, something slightly more uncomfortable than gratitude. The feeling of being seen accurately. You noticed I used the exit you'd checked, she said. Yes. You didn't check it obviously. I barely caught it. He looked up from her foot. Something moved in his eyes. The particular recalibration of someone who has been assessed more accurately than they expected. You catch a lot of things, he said. Occupational hazard, she said, which was what she'd said at dinner. And the echo of it sat between them for a second in the warm, dim cabin, while the fire made sounds in the wood stove and Mason had pulled the emergency blanket around his shoulders and was watching them both with his particular 7-year-old gravity. Cole stood and moved to the window. He looked out through the gap at the side of the shutter, scanning the tree line. Avery watched him stand there. The set of his shoulders, the stillness of it, the way his eyes moved in a pattern she recognized as systematic rather than anxious. And she made a decision. Cole. Yeah. What was your rate? He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was careful. What? Your rating in the Navy. She held his gaze. I work in tech, but I've done enough government contract work to know the structure. E rates for enlisted, O rates for officers. Special operations units have their own designations. I'm asking which one applies to you. A long pause. The fire in the wood stove shifted and settled. That's a specific question, he said. It's a specific situation. He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved away from the window and sat in one of the wooden chairs, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a second like he was deciding something. SEAL, he said. Team 6. The room was quiet. Avery had worked adjacent to enough defense contractors and government security consultants to know what those two words meant stacked together like that. SEAL Team 6 was the unit that didn't officially exist in the way that certain things didn't officially exist. The one whose operations showed up in congressional briefings with heavy redaction and in news cycles only when something had gone significantly wrong or spectacularly right. The selection process alone eliminated roughly 80% of the candidates who attempted it, and those candidates had already passed BUDS, which itself failed more than 3/4 of everyone who tried. The quiet carpenter from Durango, the single father with the calloused hands and the sawdust in his jacket creases. How long? She asked. 8 years active, he said, then 2 years in a training and advisory role before I got out. Why did you get out? He looked at Mason. The boy had pulled the emergency blanket tighter and was sitting very still, listening with the focused attention of a child who has learned that adult conversations sometimes contain information that matters. Because he needed a father more than the Navy needed another operator, Cole said, and because I'd been doing it long enough to know what it was doing to me. He said the second part more quietly. Those two things aren't in the same order they should be, but they're both true. Avery sat with that. With the honesty of it, not the polished version people gave when they wanted credit for sacrifice, but the actual layered, imperfect truth of it. Mason's mother? She asked. She kept her voice careful. Not in the picture, he said, since he was 2. He didn't offer more, and she didn't push. It's just us. Just us, Mason confirmed from his cot, with the matter-of-factness of someone stating the weather. Cole looked at his son, and something that might have been both pain and gratitude moved across his face simultaneously. One of those expressions that doesn't have a clean name. Okay, Avery said. Okay. She was reorganizing everything, Charlotte. Her dinner, the conversation, the way he'd listened, the way he'd sat at the table in the lounge and checked every exit and held himself like someone who'd spent years being responsible for the lives of people around him. It all rearranged itself into a different shape, the same pieces, very different picture. So what do we do now? He seemed to appreciate that she'd moved on. Now I need information, he said. Who at your company knew you'd be at this specific resort on this specific night? She thought about it. Priya, my assistant, she arranged it. My board chair knows my general conference schedule. My security team has my itinerary. You have a security team? A contracted firm. They handle threat assessment and travel security for executive travel. She paused. They should have been notified tonight, but I travel with a personal detail for major events. This was a conference followed by a casual dinner. I declined the detail. Cole absorbed this. The dinner was Priya's arrangement. Did Priya know the specific blind date setup? She arranged it entirely, Avery said. She contacted Cole. She contacted you. Through someone mutual. She stopped. Who connected you to Priya? A woman named Della Marsh, Cole said. She runs a nonprofit in Denver. Said she was a college friend of your assistant's. Avery filed the name. Della Marsh. She'd heard it. She thought she'd heard it. Somewhere in the orbit of a professional relationship she couldn't immediately place. I don't know her, she said. I'll need to find out if Priya actually knows her or if the introduction was manufactured. Someone knew you'd be here and built a scenario to get you isolated, Cole said. The blind date might have been engineered to place you somewhere specific, lower profile than your conference events, less likely to have security coverage. The cold settled into Avery's chest with a thoroughness the wood stove couldn't touch. They set up the date, she said. Possibly. So Priya, maybe, Cole said, or Priya was manipulated by someone who was. Don't assume the worst about someone until you have reason to. She looked at him. That's generous, given what's happening. It's accurate, he said. Panic about people you trust when you're in the field leads to worse decisions than whatever those people actually did. He said it like a principle he'd arrived at through experience rather than theory. Right now, it doesn't matter who arranged it. It matters what we do with the next hour. Avery nodded. She pulled the emergency blanket around her shoulders. The hand crank radio, she said. Can we reach anyone? Emergency frequency, yes. But if we broadcast, they'll hear it too if they're monitoring. So we wait. We wait, and I assess what we're working with. He stood and went to the supply shelf, opening bins methodically, cataloging what was there. She watched him move through it. Headlamps, chemical heat packets, a basic med kit, rope, emergency rations, a signal mirror, a folding knife in a nylon sheath, waterproof matches. He picked up the knife and clipped it to his belt without apparent self-consciousness, the way you'd put your keys in your pocket. He still had the weapon he'd taken from the man at the side exit. She'd noticed him check it twice during their run through the trees, a quick practice press check confirming the chamber. And he'd kept it accessible without making it obvious, which was the kind of unconscious habit you built over years of carrying one. How many of them are there? She asked. I counted 4 in the immediate team, he said. 2 in the lobby, 2 at the exits. But that's a minimum number for the crowd control component, which means there's likely an external perimeter. People positioned outside to catch anyone who ran. Could be another 4 to 8, could be more. And they're all after me. The internal team is. The external perimeter might be general containment, which means they're not necessarily looking for you specifically. They're stopping anyone from leaving and calling for help. He came back to the chair, which means the resort's landlines are probably down and cell coverage is already blocked. Avery took out her phone. No signal. Not the usual 1-bar mountain uncertainty. A flat 0. No carrier? Nothing. They're jamming it, she said. Yes. That takes equipment. That takes planning well in advance. She looked at him. This isn't impulsive. This is organized. Organized and funded, he agreed. The gear I saw on those 2 was quality, not military surplus. Current generation. which means money. Yes. She turned the phone over in her hands. The screen showed the time, 9:47 p.m., and nothing else useful. She thought about the list she'd mentally started in the lounge when the sounds had first reached her. The acquisition talks, the litigation, the government contract, the patent dispute. "There's a man named Warren Holt," she said slowly. Cole waited. "He runs a competitor firm. We're both bidding on a federal infrastructure contract, the kind that doesn't come up twice in a decade. It's worth approximately $900 million over 5 years. His company has been in financial difficulty for 18 months. If he loses this contract to us, he probably doesn't recover." She paused. "He has connections in private security circles, military background, Army, not special operations, but he'd know who to hire." "Is he connected to the conference?" "He's not at Tech Forward, but he'd know I was here. The program was public." She exhaled. "This is a lot to process." "Take your time," Cole said. "We've got time right now." She looked at him. He was sitting in the wooden chair with his elbows on his knees, completely settled into the present moment in a way she found both strange and steadying. He wasn't projecting ahead into panic. He wasn't stuck behind in shock. He was just here, in this cabin, in this problem, with the same quality of attention he'd brought to dinner. "Does this happen to you a lot?" she said. "Kidnapping attempts at mountain resorts?" "Sitting in the middle of a crisis and seeming perfectly fine." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm not perfectly fine," he said. "I'm functional. Those are different things. I've had a lot of practice being functional when fine wasn't an option." A pause. "I'll fall apart later, probably. I generally do. Just not in front of it." She found that honest in a way that helped. "I'm scared," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because he'd offered her his actual truth. And her actual truth was apparently looking for a way out of her chest. I'm not someone who gets scared easily, but this is the correct thing to be scared of," he said. "You're not wrong to be scared. You're also handling it." He met her eyes. "Both things are true." Mason, from his cot, said quietly, "Dad gets scared sometimes." Cole looked at his son. "Mason." "He told me it's okay to feel it," Mason continued, as if reporting important information that had been unfairly suppressed. "He said being scared means you know something real is happening." "That's what I told him," Cole said to Avery, with the slightly pained expression of a parent whose private lessons to their child were being publicly reviewed. Avery almost laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, but because the realness of it, a 7-year-old earnestly reporting his father's emotional tutorials in a ski patrol cabin while armed men searched the mountain, was so specific and human that something in her chest loosened slightly. "Smart kid," she said. "He talks too much," Cole said. "I'm right here," Mason pointed out. "I know where you are," Cole told him. "Go to sleep if you can. I'll wake you if we need to move." Mason looked doubtful, but lay down on the cot and pulled the emergency blanket up and closed his eyes with the particular deliberateness of a child deciding to try. Avery watched him settle and thought about what kind of childhood produced a 7-year-old who could attempt sleep on command in a crisis, and what that said about the life Cole Maddox had been building in Durango. The workshop, the small house, the deliberate, ordinary peace of it. Cole moved to the window again. His eyes swept the tree line in that systematic way. "How did you end up a carpenter?" she asked, keeping her voice low. He was quiet for a moment, still watching the window. "When I got out, I needed something that was the opposite of everything I'd been doing," he said. "Something you made with your hands, one piece at a time, that couldn't hurt anybody. Something where the outcome of the day was a thing that existed and hadn't existed before." He paused. "Turns out I was decent at it. Turns out Mason liked coming to the workshop after school. Turns out a lot of things. Do you miss it? The teams, the work?" "Some days," he said, not hesitating over it. "Some days I miss it the way you'd miss a version of yourself that no longer exists. Not because you want it back, but because you knew who you were inside it." He glanced back at Mason on the cot, the small chest rising and falling. "But I know who I am inside this too. Just took longer to learn." Avery sat with that. With the particular shape of it, a man who'd left something enormous and built something smaller and quieter, and who seemed to be in the process of making peace with the fact that small and quiet was not the same as lesser. She thought about her own apartment, 1,200 square feet in San Francisco that she'd decorated once and not touched since. The running shoes by the door she used 4 mornings a week because exercise was optimization, not pleasure. The empty second bedroom, she told herself, was for guests and was never used for guests. The Garrett situation, as Priya called it, Marcus Garrett, 18 months ago, a man she'd actually liked who'd eventually told her that being with her felt like competing for attention with a company, and who hadn't been wrong. She'd told Priya to arrange a blind date, and then she'd sat across a dinner table from this man and spent half of it checking her phone. Cole made a small sound, not quite a word, more like an intake of breath with a decision attached to it, and moved away from the window fast. "Someone's in the trees," he said, low and immediate. Avery was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. "How close?" 200 yards. Moving this direction." He went to Mason and touched his shoulder. Mason was awake instantly. Not the slow surfacing of a child woken from deep sleep, but the immediate alertness of a child who had apparently been only lightly present in sleep to begin with. "Buddy, we might need to move." Mason sat up and nodded. Cole looked at Avery. "There's a back access panel in the floor. It's a snow hazard hatch, emergency exit. It'll put us out the backside of the cabin." He'd found this in his initial sweep when they'd arrived, she realized. He'd cataloged the entire structure without appearing to. If they get within 100 yards, we go through it. If they stop or redirect, we hold. And if they don't stop? Then we have a different conversation, he said. He'd moved to the side of the door, not in front of it, to the side where the wall would provide cover if the door came in. The weapon was in his hand now, held low, and he was very still in the way of someone who had learned that stillness was a tactical asset as much as a physical one. Avery picked up the folding knife from the shelf where he'd left it. Cole glanced at her. "I'm not going to just stand there," she said. He nodded once. No discussion. She gripped the knife. She'd never held one with actual intent before, and she was aware of that gap in her experience, but the weight of it was real and the reality of it helped. And stood on the opposite side of the door from Cole and listened. The sounds from the forest were not loud. They were the careful, deliberate sounds of someone trying not to make noise, which was itself noise if you knew how to listen for it. The slightly wrong quality of disturbed snow, the absence of natural forest sounds in a moving corridor, the occasional barely audible creak of a boot on frozen ground. One person, she thought. Maybe two. She could hear her own heartbeat. Cole's face was entirely calm. Not empty. There was concentration there, active and focused, but calm in the way of a surface that runs very deep. She watched him in the dim glow of the wood stove's light coming under the stove door. This man who had made furniture in a workshop in Durango and coached his son on how to say thank you to waiters. And she thought, he has done this before. He has stood in exactly this position, in exactly this quality of stillness, and he has done this before. Many times, in places far worse than a ski patrol cabin. The footsteps outside stopped. 20 seconds of silence. Cole didn't move. 30 seconds. 40. Then the footsteps resumed, and they were moving away, not toward the cabin, away from it, angling south along the tree line. Whoever it was had either missed the cabin or decided against approaching it. Avery breathed out. Cole stayed in position for another full 60 seconds before he moved from the door. He set the weapon on the table and rolled his neck once, the first physical acknowledgement she'd seen from him that any of this was a strain. "They're sweeping the perimeter," he said. "Standard pattern. They'll come back around." He looked at the hand-crank radio on the shelf. "We need to make a decision about broadcasting. If we broadcast, they might pinpoint us. If we don't broadcast, the resort's guests and staff are still inside with those people, and no one knows what's happening." He said it evenly, but the weight of it was clear. State police response time to this location is approximately 40 minutes from the Valley Post, longer if the road's iced. So we broadcast and risk them finding us. Or we wait and hope someone inside the resort has found a way to call out. He looked at her. "Your call." She stared at him. "You're giving me the call?" "You're the target," he said. You have the most information about what they want and why, and this is your life. He held her gaze. I'll back whatever you decide. Nobody had said that to her in a very long time. Not like this, not with the clean simplicity of actually meaning it. She picked up the hand crank radio. How do I use this? She said. He came and showed her the frequency, the channel, the cadence of an emergency broadcast call. His hands over hers briefly, adjusting her grip on the crank. She felt the warmth of them, which was ridiculous to notice right now, and she noticed it anyway. Keep it short, he said. Location, nature of emergency, number of hostiles, if you can estimate. She nodded. She looked at the radio. She thought about the 80-odd people inside the Black Ridge Summit Resort, and the armed men who were inside with them, and the 40-minute window that stood between that situation and the sound of helicopters. She started cranking. The radio hissed to life, static and frequency, and she held the transmit button and spoke clearly into the night. This is an emergency. Black Ridge Summit Resort, Summit County, Colorado. Armed hostage situation, minimum 8 to 12 personnel, coordinated entry. Multiple guests and staff held inside. There is at least one confirmed attempt at targeted abduction. She paused. I repeat, this is not a drill. Black Ridge Summit Resort, armed hostage situation, requesting immediate state police and law enforcement response. She released the transmit button. The radio hissed. Cole was at the window again, checking the tree line. How long until they triangulate that? She asked. 10 minutes if they're running active monitoring equipment. Maybe less. He turned from the window. We should move. To where? Higher ground, northeast. There's a ridge that overlooks the resort's access road. If police come up the mountain, we'll see them before the perimeter team does, and it gives us high ground. Avery stood and looked at Mason, who had put his emergency blanket around his shoulders like a cape and was standing beside his cot ready to move. His jaw was still set. His eyes were still tired and still frightened and still holding. You're doing great, she told him. He looked at her with 7-year-old seriousness. Are you going to be okay? Yes, she said. She said it the same way Cole had told Mason they'd fix the cold. Not as a certainty she could guarantee, but as a direction she was committed to. Mason seemed to accept that. Cole pulled the hatch in the floor, and cold air came up through it, immediate and hard. And the dark below it was the dark of the mountain in December with men in tactical gear moving through the trees. He went through first, checked the space, and reached back up. Mason, he said, and lifted his son through the hatch and set him on the snow outside. Then he reached back for Avery. She took his hand and went through the hatch into the cold, and the three of them moved into the trees again, northeast, toward higher ground, with the sound of the wind and the snow, and somewhere far below them, the amber glow of the resort growing smaller through the branches. The radio broadcast was out there now, moving at the speed of radio waves toward whatever receiver would catch it first. 40 minutes if the roads cooperated, longer if they didn't. Cole moved through the trees, and Avery moved with him, and Mason moved between them, and none of them spoke because there was nothing to say that the situation wasn't already saying. The mountain held its cold, and they kept moving up. The ridge was harder to reach than Cole had made it sound, which Avery suspected was intentional, not dishonesty. Just the particular economy of someone who knew that telling people the full difficulty of a thing before they attempted it sometimes made them attempt it worse. The northeast face of the mountain was steeper than the approach to the cabin had been, and the snow here was deeper, uncompacted, the kind that swallowed your leg to the knee if you stepped wrong. Avery was wearing wool socks and nothing else on her feet, which was better than stockings and infinitely worse than boots, and every step was a negotiation between the cold in the terrain and the need to keep moving without making noise. Cole had given her his outer jacket before they'd left the cabin. She'd refused it twice. He'd put it on her the third time without asking, and she'd accepted it because her hands were shaking, and the shaking was no longer purely adrenaline. Mason was between them. He moved better than she expected a 7-year-old to move through this terrain, picking his steps with a care that looked practiced. And she realized after a few minutes that he'd done this before. Not in crisis, but in daylight, for fun, the way kids in mountain towns learn to move through snow before they learn to ride bikes. This was his landscape in a way it wasn't hers. Cole set a pace that was demanding but sustainable, and he checked on both of them every 4 or 5 minutes, not hovering, just a glance backward, a brief assessment, and adjusted the route twice based on what she could only interpret as information she didn't have access to. Once he'd stopped them completely for 30 seconds, hand raised, and they'd all gone still in the dark, while something moved through the trees to their west at a distance that was too far to see and too close for comfort. Then he'd moved them on. By the time they reached the ridge, Avery's legs were burning and her feet had cycled back through pain into a kind of numb determination, and Mason's breathing had gone from steady to slightly labored, the altitude and the cold and the sustained effort combining into something real. Cole pulled them back from the ridge's edge by about 15 feet and found a position behind a fallen log that was large enough to provide cover while offering a sightline down through the trees toward the resort's access road below. The view was worth the climb. From here, the Blackridge Summit Resort was laid out below them like a lit diagram. The main building's warm windows, the parking lot's security lamps, the dark shapes of vehicles clustered at the entrance. She could see, now that she was looking at it from above, that there were 2 dark vans parked at angles across the lot that hadn't been there when she'd arrived for the conference. Parked the way vehicles were parked when you wanted them to be movable fast, not the way guests parked when they intended to stay the night. "Those are theirs," Cole said quietly, beside her. He was on his stomach behind the log, watching the scene below with a stillness that had its own particular quality. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone processing everything visible and filing it in real time. "How many do you count?" she asked. In the lot, 2 external sentries, one on the east approach, one by the main entrance. He paused. "There's a third one moving, by the equipment outbuilding on the north side. He's the one who was sweeping our direction earlier." She'd been looking at the same view and had identified the 2 sentries and not the third. She found him now. A barely visible dark shape near the outbuilding, moving in a slow arc. "You saw him from inside the cabin?" "Heard him," Cole said. "The snow muffles footsteps, but not entirely. Different compression pattern when someone's trying to be quiet versus not." Mason was pressed against the log beside his father, looking out at the resort below with an expression that was somewhere between frightened and transfixed, a child encountering the world at a scale he hadn't been prepared for. Cole noticed and put a hand on his son's back. Just that. A steady pressure between the shoulder blades, not a word. And Mason's breathing evened out slightly. The road below was empty. No headlights coming up the mountain, no flicker of approaching police vehicles. The radio broadcast had gone out 22 minutes ago, Avery calculated. If the state police post in the valley had received it clearly, they'd have been mobilizing for 18 minutes. 40 minutes total response time meant they had roughly 18 minutes left, assuming clear roads, assuming the broadcast had been received, assuming a dozen variables she couldn't control. "It was received," Cole said, and she realized she'd spoken the uncertainty out loud without meaning to. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it was a clean transmission on an emergency frequency. Someone caught it." He looked at the road below. "The question is whether they caught enough detail to know what they're walking into. If they don't know what they're walking into, they'll approach cautiously, which slows them down, but they'll approach." He glanced at her. Law enforcement responses to armed incidents at resorts are not improvised. They have protocols. They'll stage at the base of the access road and assess before committing. "Which means everyone inside is still inside for longer." "Yes." She looked at the lit windows below and thought about the 80-odd people in that building. The conference attendees, the resort staff, the bartender who dropped behind the bar when the command started. People who'd come to a luxury mountain conference and were now on the floor of a lobby with guns pointed at them because of something tangentially connected to Avery Sinclair's contract pipeline. The weight of it was not abstract. "This is because of me," she said. Cole looked at her. "This is because of whoever sent those men," he said. "They sent them for me." "Yeah," he said. He didn't soften it. "And you didn't ask them to. And you didn't know they were coming, and none of that changes the fact that you need to stay focused on what's in front of us rather than the accounting." He paused. "There'll be time for the accounting later. Right now it doesn't help." She knew he was right. She also knew that the accounting was going to be very heavy when later arrived, and some part of her was already sitting in it, which was the part she had to keep managing while the rest of her stayed present on this ridge in the cold. She looked at the access road. Still empty. Then Mason said very quietly, "Someone's coming out of the building." She looked. He was right. A door on the north face of the resort, a service entrance, had opened, and a figure was coming through it. Not tactical gear, civilian clothes. A man in a gray jacket moving fast and low, staying close to the building's wall, heading toward the equipment outbuilding from the south side, while the sentry swept his arc from the north. "He's going to run into the sentry," Avery said. 30 seconds, Cole confirmed. The figure in the gray jacket hadn't seen the sentry yet. He was moving with the focused desperation of someone who had a plan and was committed to it, which meant he hadn't built in enough margin for the possibility that his plan was incomplete. He reached the corner of the equipment outbuilding and stopped, looked around, and started moving north along the outbuilding's wall. The sentry was coming around the far corner. "No," Avery said under her breath. Cole was already on his feet. "Stay here," he said. He said it to both of them, to Mason and Avery simultaneously. And the tone was the one that didn't leave room for negotiation. Not commanding exactly, just extremely clear. Then he went over the log and down the ridge face in a controlled, rapid descent that managed to be fast enough to matter and quiet enough not to announce itself, angling through the trees toward the north side of the property at a pace that shouldn't have been possible on that slope, in that snow, and apparently was. Avery grabbed Mason's arm reflexively, pulling him closer to her behind the log. "He does this," Mason said. She looked at him. "Does what?" "Goes," Mason said. "When someone needs help, he just goes." He said it without pride or complaint, just the flat reporting of a child who had organized this fact into his understanding of his father a long time ago and had made his peace with it. He always comes back. "Has he—" She stopped. "Has this happened before? Something like this?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "Not like this," he said, "but there was a car accident on the highway near our house last spring, and a thing at the hardware store when a man was having a medical emergency." He thought about it. "He goes. That's just what he does." Avery looked down at the property below, trying to find Cole in the dark. She couldn't. He had simply ceased to be visible in the trees, absorbed into the mountain's shadow with a completeness that reminded her of something. The way certain people could walk into a crowd and disappear. Except this wasn't a crowd. It was a dark mountainside in December, and he'd moved through it like water finding a level. Below, the figure in the gray jacket had stopped at the corner of the outbuilding. The sentry had stopped too. She couldn't see the sentry from this angle, but she could see the man in the gray jacket go completely rigid. The full-body freeze of someone who has just encountered something they weren't prepared for. Then the sentry went down. Not a sound she could identify from this distance, just the figure of the sentry there, and then not there, and the man in the gray jacket standing completely still for a full 3 seconds before a hand appeared from the shadow beside him, gesturing toward the tree line. Cole materialized out of the dark like he'd been part of it, his hand on the man's arm, moving him toward the trees at the north edge of the property with the brisk efficiency of someone who had approximately 0 time for the man's shock or gratitude. They reached the tree line. They disappeared into it. 4 minutes later, Cole came up the ridge from a slightly different angle than he'd descended, the man in the gray jacket behind him breathing hard and stumbling once on the slope and catching himself. Cole reached the fallen log and crouched beside Avery and Mason without ceremony. "Resort security," he said, nodding at the man. "Name?" "Darnell," the man managed. He was mid-30s, broad-shouldered, the gray jacket she'd seen from above, now visible as a resort staff windbreaker. His face was stunned, and his breathing was still working on normalizing. He looked at Cole with an expression that was trying to process something his brain hadn't fully authorized yet. "How did you— I didn't even see—" "Darnell," Cole said. "How many people inside? What's the situation?" The man pulled himself together with visible effort. 83 guests and staff when they came in. They've got everyone in the main ballroom, pushed them in there about 10 minutes after the takeover started. I counted 9 of them, but there might be more I didn't see. They shot out the landlines and they've got something jamming the cell signal. He looked at Avery. They asked for you by name, specifically. They've got a photograph. He paused. Are you Avery Sinclair? Yes, she said. Darnell exhaled. They said if you come in voluntarily in the next hour, everyone else goes free. If you don't, he stopped. What did they say happens if she doesn't? Cole said. Darnell looked uncomfortable. They said they'd start making the situation uncomfortable for the people inside. He said it in the careful language of someone paraphrasing something that had been considerably less careful in its original form. Avery felt the cold settle deeper into her chest. That's a negotiating position, Cole said. They're not going to harm 80 people in a mountain resort. The liability calculus on that is catastrophic for whoever sent them. It turns a targeted abduction into a mass incident and brings a federal response that buries the original objective. He looked at Avery. They want you, alive. That's the only version of this that makes financial sense for whoever's behind it. So everyone inside is leverage, she said. Yes. And you're saying I shouldn't go in? I'm saying the leverage only works until law enforcement arrives, Cole said. After that, the dynamic changes completely, and the threat to the people inside decreases rapidly because the men inside have a new and more immediate problem to manage. He looked at her steadily. I'm also saying that if you walk in there voluntarily, you become a hostage, and hostages have significantly less control over their outcomes than people on the outside of the building. I know that, she said. I know you know it, he said. I'm saying it out loud because knowing it and sitting with the cost of it are different things. She looked at the lit windows below. 83 people on the floor of a ballroom because of a contract she'd pursued, a company she'd built, a success that had apparently been visible enough to make someone decide that the most efficient path forward was to put armed men in a mountain resort in December. How long? She said. Cole looked at the access road. 15 minutes, maybe 10. You're sure they're coming? Someone caught that broadcast, he said. Yes. He said it like he believed it. She chose to believe it with him because the alternative was a calculation she wasn't willing to run yet. Darnell was watching Cole with the particular expression of someone reassembling a picture that had been wrong the first time. You were in the conference? He said. No, Cole said. Then how are you, what are you? Currently trying to keep 3 people alive on a ridge in the cold, Cole said. We can do the introductions later. Darnell looked at Mason, who was sitting against the log with his emergency blanket and his calm 7-year-old gravity, and Darnell's expression shifted into something that looked like it hurt. You brought a kid up here? He brought himself, Mason said. Despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the weight pressing down on the ridge and the men in tactical gear below, Avery almost smiled. Cole was looking at the property again, and something had changed in his focus, a tightening, a specific quality of attention that she'd learned in the past 2 hours meant he'd seen or heard something the rest of them hadn't. Movement, he said quietly. She looked. 2 figures had come out of the resort's main entrance and were moving across the parking lot toward the tree line on the east side. Not sentries doing a patrol, they were moving with direction, toward the trees, heading upslope. Searching. They triangulated the radio, Cole said. You said 10 minutes, she said. I said maybe 10, he said, already standing. He looked at Darnell. Can you get back to the tree line east of the property and stay low? Don't move until you see police lights on the road. Darnell looked at the 2 figures crossing the parking lot. What are you going to do? Draw them north, Cole said, away from the road so they're out of position when the response comes. He picked up the weapon from where he'd set it against the log and checked the chamber with that same practiced press. He looked at Avery. I need you and Mason to stay on this ridge, behind this log. Don't move unless they come within 50 yards. She stood. Cole? Avery? There are 2 of them. I know. You've been awake since whatever time you woke up this morning. You ran up a mountain, you went down a ridge and back up. You're not fresh. Something crossed his face. Not irritation. A more complicated thing. I know my situation, he said. I'm asking you to trust my judgment about it. She looked at him. In the dim light, with the snow coming down and the resort lit below them, and everything that had happened in the past 3 hours sitting between them, like a shared thing that had changed the texture of the air. She looked at Cole Maddox and she thought about a man who'd left something enormous because his son needed a father, and who'd built something quiet and intentional out of the other side of it, and who had spent the whole of that quiet life being exactly who he was, whether anyone was watching or not. She thought about him checking the exits at dinner and not doing anything about it because there was nothing to do. Just information, just the habit of a man who stayed aware. "If you get hurt," she said. "I'll manage," he said. "That's not Avery." He said her name with a weight that wasn't dramatic, just present. "I'm not leaving you up here." She understood that he meant both things simultaneously. "I'm not abandoning you on this ridge, and I'm not the kind of person who leaves." Both sentences true, layered inside each other. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He looked at Mason. His son looked back at him with those dark eyes that were a copy of his father's, and something passed between them, wordless, particular to the two of them, the language of a father and a child who had been through enough together that they'd developed a private vocabulary. "Stay with Avery," Cole said. "I know," Mason said. Cole put his hand on his son's head. That same brief, deliberate press. Then he turned and went north along the ridge, moving below the crest so he stayed out of the sight line of the figures crossing the parking lot, and within 30 seconds he was gone again, swallowed by the dark and the trees. Mason moved closer to Avery without being directed. She put her arm around him, his small body tense and cold under the emergency blanket. She kept her eyes on the property below. Darnell had not left. He was still crouched behind the log, watching the two figures who were now at the tree line on the east side, moving into the trees with lights. Not tactical lights, just phone flashlights, which meant they were probably not the best members of the team, but the available members. And they were moving upslope on the east face, which would take them away from the ridge toward the cabin, toward the path that Cole and Avery had come up, where they would find the cabin, where they would find the used wood stove still warm and the floor hatch open and the supply bins disturbed. Cole had thought of this. She understood, watching the two figures begin their climb on the east face, that he had thought of exactly this. That discovery of the cabin would tell them which direction she'd gone, and that drawing them north instead of east mattered, and that a man who had run 8 years of operations for a unit that didn't officially exist had a fairly specific idea of how to manage a two-person search team on a mountain at night. She stayed behind the log. The next 14 minutes were the longest of her life. She could hear in the distance to the north sounds she couldn't fully interpret. Movement in trees. Once a voice that was cut off quickly. Once a sound that might have been something falling in the snow. She kept her attention on the two figures on the east face who had reached the tree line and were moving up slope, and on the parking lot below, and on Mason beside her who was breathing steadily and not talking, the way he got when he was managing something internally. "He's fine," Mason said, at one point, quietly. She wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. She thought, "You're 7 years old and you're sitting on a mountain ridge at 10:30 at night telling me your father is fine." She thought, what did this child carry in ordinary life, in the ordinary days of the Durango workshop and the school pickup and the dinner table, knowing what his father had been before the carpenter, before the small house, before the quiet that they'd built together. She pulled him slightly closer. At 11 minutes, the first lights appeared on the access road below. Not one set. 3. 4. Coming up the mountain in convoy, moving fast but not reckless. And she could see even from the ridge that these were the kind of vehicles that law enforcement used when they expected to need what they had in them. Dark SUVs and one marked vehicle, the lights silent, no sirens, which meant they were staging rather than announcing, exactly as Cole had predicted. "There," Darnell said. "I see them," Avery said. The sentries in the parking lot saw them too. She could see the figures by the main entrance go into motion, one of them moving back inside, one staying, and the subtle choreography of a situation beginning to change shape around its edges. The men inside knew now. Whatever they'd been planning, whatever the next hour had looked like in their operational design, it had just acquired a new and inconvenient variable. She was scanning the north tree line for Cole when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun. One of the search team, the east face pair, or what she'd thought was the east face pair, was 15 feet away, above them on the ridge, coming down. He'd come from above rather than below, which meant he'd gone farther east than she'd tracked and looped north and come around, and he hadn't used his flashlight in the last stretch. And she had not been watching the ridge above her because she'd been watching the road and the resort, and in the cold and the darkness and the sustained stress of the past 3 hours she'd missed it. He was 6 feet tall and in tactical gear, and he had a weapon, and he was looking directly at her. She stepped in front of Mason. It was pure reflex. She didn't plan it, didn't weigh it, didn't run the cost-benefit. She just moved and put herself between the man with the weapon and the child behind her, the same way you'd cover something valuable with your body before you'd consciously decided you were willing to take the damage. The man raised his weapon. His eyes were on her. "Sinclair," he said. "Don't move." She didn't move. "Step away from the kid." "No," she said. She didn't recognize her own voice. It was very steady, which was not how she felt. "Step away from the—" Cole came out of the trees to the man's left with no warning and no announcement, the way weather came. Not from somewhere visible, but simply present, suddenly, in a way that rearranged everything. He hit the man low and to the outside. The weapon discharged once into the snow and the sky, and then it was gone from the man's hands. And they went down together in the snow, and it was brutal and fast and not clean at all. Not the choreography of an action sequence, but the grinding, desperate efficiency of someone who needed to end something quickly, in a space where he couldn't afford for it to go long. It went 15 seconds. It felt like more. When Cole stood up, he was breathing hard for the first time all night. His left arm was pressed against his side in a way that wasn't how you held your arm when nothing was wrong. He had the man's weapon in his right hand, and his face was drawn tight with something he was managing. Avery came to him immediately. "You're hurt." "I'm standing," he said. "Cole." "The arm. It's not—" He exhaled. "It's not structural. I took a hit from the fall." He looked past her at Mason, who was standing behind the log with Darnell, and the tightness in his face eased very slightly. "You're okay." "You're bleeding," Mason said. Cole looked at his own arm. His sleeve was dark and wet in a way that wasn't snow. He looked at it with the expression of someone who has been informed of an inconvenience rather than a crisis. "Okay," he said. "Yeah." "The first aid kit," Avery said. "We left it in the cabin." "There's a kit in the van," Darnell said, already moving. "Police vehicles have trauma kits. They're staging at the base. I can go down." "Go," Cole said. Darnell went. Below them, the parking lot had become active in the way of a situation tipping. The police convoy had reached the base of the road, and the lights were visible now even from the resort, and the 2 sentries by the main entrance were no longer stationary. One of them had gone inside. The other was standing in the parking lot, looking up the road with the particular body language of someone whose situation had materially changed. Cole sat down on the log. It was, Avery noted, the first time she'd seen him sit down since they'd left the resort. He sat the way people sat when their body had been asking them to sit for some time, and they'd finally listened. A controlled descent that was only barely controlled. She sat beside him. Mason came and stood in front of his father and looked at the arm with his jaw set and his eyes doing something careful and frightened, and Cole reached out with his good arm and pulled his son against his side. "I'm okay," Cole said. "I need you to hear me say that." Mason pressed his face against his father's shoulder, the same way he'd pressed it there when Cole had carried him out of the lounge at the end of dinner, and for a moment he was not a 7-year-old who had held himself together on a mountain all night. He was just a kid whose dad was hurt and who had been scared for several hours, and who was somewhere past the outer limit of what a 7-year-old should reasonably be asked to manage. Cole held him with his good arm and didn't say anything else. Avery sat on the other side of the log with her ruined feet and Cole's jacket around her shoulders, and looked at the resort below where police lights were now cresting the access road, where the situation was beginning its final rearrangement, and she thought about a CEO who'd checked her phone during dinner while a man across the table quietly cataloged every exit in the room. She thought about what she'd had on offer that evening and what she'd been looking at instead. Cole looked at her sideways, Mason still pressed against his shoulder. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking." "Out loud this time." "No," she said. "Not yet." She looked at the lights coming up the road. "Ask me later." He nodded. He settled Mason slightly, and his son's breathing was slowing, the crisis adrenaline beginning to metabolize into exhaustion, and the boy's eyes were drooping now, with the involuntary gravity of a child's body demanding what it was owed. "He's going to sleep," Avery said. "He does that," Cole said. "Goes full speed and then just stops." A pause. "Like a battery that hits zero at a completely inconvenient moment." "He held up," she said. "He held up really well." Cole looked at his son's face, half hidden against his shoulder. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He did." Below them, the first police vehicle reached the parking lot, and the lights were moving now, multiple beams sweeping the property, and she could hear, faintly, carried up the mountain by the cold, still air, the first sounds of shouted commands from the direction of the main entrance. The cavalry had arrived. Cole looked at the scene below with the particular expression of someone who had built to a moment and was now watching it arrive without him in it, which was its own complicated thing. The man who'd held the position long enough for the relief to come, now sitting on a log in the snow while it happened without requiring anything more from him. His arm was still bleeding through his sleeve. She reached into the first aid bag that Darnell had left behind when he'd descended, found a pressure bandage, and held it out. Cole looked at it, then at her. "I can do it," she said. "I know you can," he said, which was what she'd said to him earlier in the cabin about the socks, and she registered the echo of it in both directions and said nothing, just took his arm carefully and pressed the bandage against the wound and held it. His arm was tense under her hands. Then it wasn't. Below, through the trees and the snow and the cold Colorado dark, the sounds of the resort being reclaimed carried up the mountain in pieces. Commands, movement, one sharp shout that ended quickly. The lights swept back and forth across the snow. The vans in the parking lot were boxed in by police vehicles. It was almost over. Cole's head dropped back slightly, and he looked up through the gap in the canopy at the sky, which was clearing in patches, the snow thinning, and through one of the gaps, the particular cold brightness of a winter star was briefly visible before another cloud moved over it. "SEAL Team 6, Avery said, after a moment. 8 years. Training and advisory on top of that." "Yeah." "And then a workshop in Durango and custom cabinetry." "Yeah." She thought about it. "The cabinetry must be really good." He looked at her sidelong. Something moved in his face. Exhausted, hurting, real. "It's decent," he said. She kept the pressure on his arm. Mason was asleep. The mountain held them in its cold, and the lights moved below, and somewhere in the dark, the men who had come to the Black Ridge Summit Resort with tactical gear and a photograph of a woman in a red dress were being separated from their weapons and pressed against the cold hoods of police vehicles, while the guests they'd held at gunpoint were led out of a ballroom in pairs. None of that was Cole's problem anymore tonight. For the first time in several hours, none of it was a problem he had to solve. He sat on the log on the ridge with his son asleep against his shoulder and Avery Sinclair's hands pressing a bandage against his arm, and he breathed slowly, the way people breathed when they were giving themselves permission to be still. It was not a perfect ending to a night that had started with elk medallions and crayon drawings, but it was the version where everyone on the ridge was alive. That, Cole Maddox had learned a long time ago in places far worse than this, was the version that counted. They came down the mountain at 12:40 in the morning. A state police sergeant named Briggs had climbed the ridge to reach them after Darnell had made it to the staging area and given enough information for the response team to understand there were civilians above the property line. Briggs was a compact woman in her 40s with a flashlight and a trauma kit, and the particular no-nonsense competence of someone who had seen enough situations to stop being surprised by any specific configuration of them. She'd taken one look at Cole's arm, at Mason asleep against his father's shoulder, at Avery in a borrowed jacket and wool socks in the snow, and had simply started doing what needed doing without editorializing about any of it. She'd dressed Cole's arm properly. The cut was deep enough to need stitches, but not deep enough to have touched anything structural, which was the version Cole had claimed from the beginning, and which Briggs confirmed with the brisk certainty of someone who'd seen both kinds. Cole accepted the treatment without complaint and without the particular macho performance of someone pretending it didn't hurt, which Avery noted. It clearly hurt. He sat still for it anyway. Mason woke up during the descent, groggy and disoriented for about 30 seconds, before the situation reoriented itself around him, and then he was awake and moving and asking Briggs questions about her radio equipment with the focused curiosity of a child whose mind had apparently decided that the best response to an extraordinary night was comprehensive information gathering. Briggs answered him with a patience that suggested she either had kids of her own or had made peace with the kind of people who asked this many questions. The resort's parking lot when they reached it was a different landscape than the one Avery had moved through 3 hours ago in a red dress and heels. 6 state police vehicles, 2 Summit County sheriff's units, and what appeared to be a federal vehicle. Dark, unmarked, the particular brand of anonymous that announced itself by trying not to. The 2 black vans she'd identified from the ridge were still there, now hemmed in by law enforcement vehicles, their purpose completed and their utility finished. The men who'd come to the Black Ridge Summit Resort with tactical gear and a photograph were being processed in the far end of the parking lot, zip-tied, seated on the ground, a deputy moving between them with a clipboard. She counted 11. Cole had estimated 8 to 12. He'd been right about most things tonight, she thought, and the one he'd been most right about was that she hadn't been ready to fully understand who she was sitting across the dinner table from. An EMT intercepted them at the edge of the lot, and the next 40 minutes were medical and logistical in a way that scattered them temporarily. Cole taken to the back of an ambulance for the arm, Mason parked beside him, wrapped in a real blanket this time, and given hot chocolate that appeared from somewhere in the organized chaos, Avery walked through a preliminary interview by a detective named Paulson who had a recorder and a legal pad and the careful, methodical approach of someone building a case rather than satisfying curiosity. She told Paulson everything she knew, the names, the connections, the contract dispute. Warren Holt. Della Marsh, the woman who'd supposedly connected Priya to Cole, whose name Avery intended to investigate from the ground up the moment she had access to her devices. The timeline of events from the Ember Lounge to the Ridge. She was thorough in the way she was thorough about everything, complete, organized, with the particular attention to sequence and detail that 11 months of 16-hour days had honed into something close to automatic. Paulson wrote it all down and asked good follow-up questions, and at the end said, "You're going to get a call from the FBI field office in Denver in the morning. Probably early." "I'll be awake," she said. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll be awake," she said again, and he accepted this with the expression of someone who understood that telling Avery Sinclair to sleep was a recommendation rather than a directive. She found Cole after, outside the ambulance. His arm had been properly wrapped and he'd changed into a dry shirt that someone, Briggs probably, had produced from somewhere, and he was standing with a cup of coffee that he was holding in his good hand and looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man whose system was processing the distance between where the evening had started and where it had landed. Mason was sitting on the ambulance's back step beside him, still wrapped in the blanket, the hot chocolate finished, describing something to an EMT who had apparently been unable to escape the conversation. From what Avery could catch as she approached, Mason was providing a detailed tactical analysis of the Ridge operation with the authority of someone who had been a full participant rather than a 7-year-old who'd spent most of it pressed against a log in an emergency blanket. She stopped a few feet away and listened for a moment. "And then my dad went down the ridge to get the man from the resort," Mason was explaining, "because the sentry was going to find him. A sentry is someone posted to watch a specific area. My dad explained it while we were walking up." He paused. "He explains things while we're moving. He says you learn better when your body is occupied." The EMT, a young man who looked like he was reconsidering his career choices in real time, said, That's true, actually." "I know," Mason said. "He's right about most things. Not everything. He was wrong about the salmon at dinner. He said it would be good, and it was okay." Cole looked at Avery over his coffee. "The salmon was fine," he said. "The salmon was overcooked," Mason said, without looking at his father. Avery sat down on the step beside Mason. The EMT took the opportunity to exit with professional smoothness. She was in dry clothes now, too. A resort staff sweatshirt that Briggs had found, her feet in actual boots that were 2 sizes too large and did not care even slightly. The night air was still cold, but the wind had died and the snow had stopped, And the parking lot with its organized activity was warmer in the social sense than the ridge had been. The particular warmth of a situation that had resolved rather than escalated. "How's the arm?" she asked Cole. "7 stitches, he said. "I've had worse." "That's a low bar." "It's the bar I have." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The parking lot moved around them with the purposeful noise of law enforcement finishing a job, and between the two of them was the particular silence of people who have been through something together that doesn't have a clean category. "I owe you an apology," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "For what?" "Dinner," she said. "I was checking my phone. I was half somewhere else for most of it. She stopped. She started again. "You were interesting, and I was treating it like an obligation I'd agreed to attend. That was rude." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I didn't notice." "Yes, you did," she said. He looked at his coffee. "I noticed," he said. "I figured you had things going on." "I always have things going on," she said. "That's the problem." He looked at her. Not at the problem she was describing, at her. The specific, full attention kind of looking she'd noticed at the dinner table, the kind where you understood you were being seen rather than assessed. "You also put your phone down," he said. "Toward the end. You put it face down and left it there." "Mason shamed me into it." "I didn't shame you," Mason said from beside her, following the conversation with total attention. "I just described what my dad does." "That's a form of shaming," Avery told him. Mason considered this. "Maybe," he said, with the intellectual honesty of someone genuinely weighing the argument. Cole almost smiled. She'd learned to recognize the almost smile now, the slight movement at one corner of his mouth, the thing his face did when something was actually funny rather than politely funny. "You picked up his drawings," Cole said. She looked at him. "What?" "When I carried him out. His napkin drawings fell on the floor and you picked them up and put them on the table so he'd see them." He held her gaze. "I noticed." She hadn't thought he'd seen that. She'd thought he was already walking. She didn't know what to say to it, which was unusual for her. She was professionally fluent, accustomed to having the sentence ready before the previous one finished, so she said nothing, which felt like its own kind of honesty. The detective Paulson appeared at the edge of their space. "Mr. Maddox," he said, when you're ready, I'd like to take your statement." "Give me 5 minutes," Cole said. Paulson nodded and moved off. Cole looked at Mason. "You need to stay here with Avery," he said. "I'll be 20 minutes. Mason looked at Avery. Avery looked at Mason. "We'll be fine," Mason said, with the confidence of someone making a decision rather than a prediction. Cole stood, transferred his coffee to his injured arm's hand, winced slightly, transferred it back. He walked toward where Paulson was waiting, and Avery watched him go. The set of his shoulders, the slightly careful way he moved his left arm. The same contained posture that had been there all evening, just with the addition now of 7 stitches and a night on a mountain. Mason watched him too. "He's going to be tired tomorrow," Mason said. "I think so," Avery said. "He doesn't like to admit when he's tired." A pause. "He says tiredness is just information, not a verdict." She looked at the boy beside her. 7 years old, she kept thinking. 7 years old and sitting in a resort parking lot at 1 a.m. after all of that, talking about his father's relationship with tiredness, with the calm, analytical quality of a very small philosopher. "Mason," she said, "can I ask you something?" He turned to look at her with full attention. "Okay. Do you know what your dad did in the Navy, before Durango?" A brief pause. He looked down at the empty hot chocolate cup in his hands. "He was a SEAL," Mason said. "He told me when I was 6. He said I was old enough." Another pause. "He said he did things that were important but that also cost something. He said that was why they moved to Durango, because some things cost too much and you had to decide what was worth the cost." Avery sat with that, with the fact that Cole had explained this to a 6-year-old in those terms, not simplified out of meaning, but given the actual weight of it, calibrated to what a child could hold. "Are you scared of it?" she asked. "What he used to do." Mason thought about it seriously. "No," he said. "I'm proud of him, and I'm glad he stopped." He looked at his empty cup. both things at the same time. She thought about what Cole had said in the cabin. Both things are true. This child had learned that from somewhere, and she knew from where. He's a good dad, she said. Mason nodded once. Definitive. The best one I know, he said, which was the only version of the category available to him, and was also, she thought, probably accurate in the absolute sense. Inside the resort's main building, visible through the tall lobby windows, she could see people moving, conference guests and resort staff being seen to, reunited with their belongings, given whatever came after several hours on a ballroom floor under armed supervision. Several of them were being walked out to vehicles. One woman was on a phone call, gesturing with the emphatic urgency of someone reporting in to someone who had been frightened. A man in a conference lanyard was sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. 83 people, Darnell had said. 83 people who would go home to their ordinary lives with a story that would take years to lose its edge, who would have nightmares about it and tell it at dinner parties and feel the cold of it at odd moments for a long time. And all of them were going home. That was the version that had actually happened tonight, which was not the version that could have happened. And the gap between those two versions had a name, and his name was getting his arm stitched up in an ambulance and then walking across a parking lot at midnight to give his statement to a detective. She was sitting with this when her phone, still dead, she'd assumed, suddenly lit up. Signal. Partial, weak, but there. The jamming equipment had been disabled. In the next 40 seconds, 26 notifications arrived in sequence, a cascade of increasingly alarmed messages from Priya that traced the arc of the evening from Hope, the date is going okay. At 7:15 to Avery. I'm seeing something on Twitter about Black Ridge Resort. Please call me at 9:52 to 17 subsequent messages that Avery didn't read in order, just skimmed for the shape of her assistant's escalating fear. She called Priya. Priya picked up before the first ring had finished. Avery? Her voice was wrecked, the specific wreckage of someone who had spent several hours in the worst version of not knowing. Are you... I saw the news alert. They're saying there was an armed incident. I've been calling. I couldn't reach anyone. I'm okay, Avery said. I'm in the parking lot. Everyone is okay. A sound from Priya's end that was not quite a word. I'm okay, Avery said again, because she understood that Priya needed to hear it more than once. The police are here. It's over. The man, Cole, he's here. He's fine. She looked across the parking lot to where Cole was standing with Paulson, talking with the economy of someone giving information rather than telling a story. Priya, I need to ask you about Della Marsh. A pause. What? Who? Della Marsh. She supposedly connected you to Cole for the blind date. A nonprofit director in Denver. You said she was a college friend of yours. Avery, I don't know anyone named Della Marsh. Priya's voice had shifted from relief into something more careful. The setup came through Jenny Castellano. She was my roommate sophomore year at Northwestern. She said she knew a man who'd be perfect for you. She described him. I thought he sounded genuinely good. I arranged it. She never mentioned anyone named Della. Avery was quiet for a moment. Who is Jenny Castellano now? What does she do? She works in private consulting, I think. Business development. I haven't seen her in person in 2 years. We mostly keep up through... Priya stopped. Oh no. I need you to find everything you can about Jenny Castellano's current clients and employer, Avery said. Tonight, if possible. Tomorrow morning at the latest. You think she was involved? I think someone connected to whoever sent those men here engineered the blind date to place me in a low-security situation away from my detail. She kept her voice steady, which cost her something. I think it's possible Jenny was used without knowing what she was part of, or it's possible she knew more than she said. Either way, I need to know. Priya was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, not the relief and fear of the first part of the call, but the focused, professional quality that made her the best assistant Avery had ever had. I'll have something for you by 7 a.m., she said. Thank you. Avery. A pause. I'm sorry. I set up the date. If I hadn't... Stop, Avery said. Stop right there. This is not yours. She said it the way Cole had said it to her on the ridge. Flat, certain, no room for argument. Someone used you. That's on them. Do you understand me? A long pause. Yes, Priya said quietly. Good. 7 a.m. Go sleep until then. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. The notifications were still coming in, slower now. News alerts, LinkedIn notifications from conference attendees posting about the incident. 2 missed calls from her board chair that she would return in the morning. The machinery of consequence was spinning up, slow and inevitable, the way it always did after something this size. There would be a press statement. There would be a board call. There would be the FBI be a board call. There would be the FBI conversation Paulson had warned her about, and the security review that her contracted firm was going to have to answer for, and the legal investigation into Warren Holt that may or may not produce what she suspected it would. There would be the question of Jenny Castellano and what Jenny knew and how deep the engineering had gone. There would be a lot. She looked at Mason, who had fallen asleep again beside her on the ambulance step, slumped against her arm with the complete physical trust of a child who had decided she was a safe place to be. His blanket pulled up to his chin and his mouth slightly open and his face, finally, completely unguarded. She had not expected to spend the evening with her arm being used as a pillow by a 7-year-old. She did not move. Cole came back 23 minutes later, close to the 5 minutes he'd asked for, which she'd known was optimistic. He saw Mason asleep against her arm and stopped. Sorry, he said, low. Don't apologize, she said. He sat down on the step on Mason's other side, careful of his arm, careful of the sleeping child between them. He looked at his son's face in the parking lot light. The same particular expression he'd had all evening when he looked at Mason, that thing without a clean name. They want me to come to the field office tomorrow, he said. Denver, full debrief. Me too, probably, she said. The FBI. I know some people there, he said, former colleagues who went federal after the teams. He said it the way he said most things about his past, present tense because it was still true, but held at a slight remove from the current version of himself. It'll be thorough. Are you worried about what they'll find? He looked at her. About what I did tonight? About any of it? No, he said. He said it simply, without defensiveness. I did what the situation required. That's a clean account. She believed him. That was the thing about the evening, she thought. She had spent the whole of dinner not fully trusting her own assessment of him, finding him interesting but discounting it, checking her phone, and keeping one eye on the professional circuit she was more comfortable navigating. And then the situation had stripped away every layer of context that wasn't character, and what had been under all of it was exactly what she'd half seen across the dinner table and hadn't trusted herself to believe. I want to say something, she said. Cole waited. I underestimated you, she said. Not just tonight. At dinner. I looked at the flannel and the carpenter and I looked at your life in Durango and I thought... She stopped, started differently. I thought I had you placed, and I was wrong. He was quiet for a moment. What did you think you saw? She was honest about it. Someone simple, she said. Someone whose world was smaller than mine. I thought interesting. I thought decent. But I thought I knew the size of it. She looked at him. I didn't. Cole looked at the ground between his feet. She couldn't read his expression, which was unusual. She'd gotten better at reading him over the course of the evening, and now she'd lost the thread of it. Can I say something back? He said. Yes. My life in Durango is small, he said. On purpose. The workshop, Mason's school, the house, the neighbors we know by name. I built it that way because I needed something that was built, not operational. Something that existed because it was good to exist rather than because it was useful. He looked up. It's not a lesser version of something bigger. It's the thing I chose. He paused. I don't need you to think it's impressive. I need you to understand that I know what I have, and I know what I traded for it, and I don't have regrets about the math. She listened to this carefully, the way he'd listened to her all evening. I don't think it's lesser, she said. I did. I don't now. She held his gaze. I think I've been running so fast in one direction for so long that I stopped being able to see directions other than forward. And I think tonight, she paused, I think tonight recalibrated something. He looked at her for a long moment. You stepped in front of him, he said, when the man came down the ridge. She blinked. He had a weapon, and Mason was behind me. I know why you did it, Cole said. I'm saying you did it before you thought about it. That's not nothing. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. The automatic nature of it, the gap between the stimulus and the response that had been zero, just movement, just her body going to a place before her brain had authorized the trip. She thought about it now. Instinct, she said. Instinct comes from character, he said. You don't build that kind of reflex in a boardroom. She didn't know how to answer that, so she looked at Mason sleeping between them instead. This boy she'd met 4 hours ago over a napkin drawing of a T-Rex fighting a helicopter, and she thought, the helicopter, because it can fly away. Smart helicopter. She'd said it without thinking. He'd nodded like she'd given the right answer. Cole, she said. Yeah. The drawings, she said. The napkin drawings. Does he still have them? Cole reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the 3 folded napkins. Retrieved, she realized, at some point in the evening that she hadn't tracked. In the middle of everything, he had gone back for the napkins, or he'd had them in his pocket all along. She didn't know which. He held them for a moment, looking at them. Mason's mom left when he was 2, he said. Unprompted, quiet. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because he carries things with him. He always has, since he was very small. He keeps the napkins and the ticket stubs and the leaves from hikes and the... He stopped. He keeps things because he's learned that things disappear. So he saves the evidence that they were real. He looked at the folded napkins. I've been trying for 5 years to give him enough things that are permanent that he doesn't need to hold on so hard to the evidence. The weight of it landed somewhere in Avery's chest, settled and stayed. Is it working? She asked. He thought about it. Slowly, he said. I think slowly. Briggs appeared at the edge of their space. Mr. Maddox, there's a room available inside if you want to get the boys somewhere warmer to sleep. They've cleared the east wing. Cole looked at Mason. The boy hadn't stirred. Yeah, Cole said. Give me a minute. Briggs moved off. Cole stood carefully and transferred his coffee to his injured arm to free up the good one, and then he lifted Mason without waking him. The same practiced lift from the end of dinner, except that this time everything that had happened between that moment and this one was in the air between them, and the lift looked different because of it. He looked at Avery over his son's sleeping head. You should sleep too, he said. I know, she said. I won't. I know, he said, but you should. She stood. Her legs were sore in the specific way of someone who'd climbed a mountain in wool socks and had the muscle memory to prove it. She pulled Cole's jacket, still around her shoulders. She realized she'd been wearing it for hours, and held it out. He looked at it. Keep it for now, he said. You can give it back tomorrow. It was a small thing. It was also a sentence that assumed a tomorrow, which she registered. Okay, she said. He turned toward the resort's east entrance. She walked alongside him, not because he needed help carrying Mason, but because the 3 of them had spent a night on a mountain together, and separating before they'd fully stopped moving felt wrong, in a way she couldn't articulate. At the entrance, a resort staff member held the door. Inside it was warm and lit, and the particular controlled aftermath of a crisis that had been resolved. State police moving through, a Red Cross volunteer setting up a station, several guests sitting in the corridor with blankets and expressions that would take time to unpack. Cole stopped just inside the entrance. Room 214, he said. That's where we were before dinner. Mason's backpack is there. He looked at her. If you need anything before morning. She understood that this was not a move. It was information, offered plainly, with the same straightforward quality he'd brought to everything else. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He shifted Mason slightly in his arms, and the boy stirred, made a sound. Dad, Mason said, not fully awake. Right here, Cole said. Mason settled back into sleep. Cole looked at Avery one more time. That specific, full-attention look, the one she'd thought at dinner was just how he listened and had since come to understand was something more particular than that. "Avery," he said. "Yeah." "For what it's worth," he said, "the date was good. Before all of it." She felt something move in her chest. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of feeling, just something true and quiet, the kind that settled rather than surged. "It was," she said. "Before all of it." He walked down the corridor toward room 214. She stood and watched him go. The careful, slightly asymmetric movement of his left arm, Mason's sleeping weight against his shoulder, the flannel shirt she'd catalogued at the beginning of the evening as evidence of a simple man who had turned out to be the most complex person she'd encountered in recent memory. She turned toward the lobby. The night was over. The morning was coming with everything it was going to bring. The FBI, the board, Priya's 7 a.m. report, the long unwinding of everything that had been put in motion by people who had looked at her success and decided it was an obstacle to be removed rather than a thing she had built. She sat down in one of the lobby chairs and looked at her phone. 22 unread emails. The number had grown while she'd been outside. She looked at them for a moment. Then she turned the phone face down on the chair's armrest. She sat in the quiet lobby of the Blackridge Summit Resort at 2 a.m. in a borrowed sweatshirt and 2 sizes too large boots and a carpenter's jacket still around her shoulders, and she thought about a 7-year-old boy who kept napkin drawings as evidence that things had been real. She thought about what she would keep from tonight. She thought she was going to keep quite a lot of it. Outside the tall lobby windows, the snow had stopped completely. The sky above the mountains was clearing, the clouds pulling apart to reveal the kind of cold, deep dark that cities never had. Pure altitude dark, salted with stars. The Milky Way faint but visible along the ridgeline above the resort. Avery sat with it. She was not checking her phone. The FBI arrived at 7:14 in the morning, which was 14 minutes later than Paulson had predicted, and 2 hours and 6 minutes after Avery had stopped pretending she was going to sleep. She'd spent the intervening hours in the lobby chair and then in the small business center off the main corridor, using the resort's hardwired computer to do what she could without her own devices. Basic research, publicly available information, the kind of preliminary digging that told you which direction to look without yet showing you what was there. She'd found 3 things about Jenny Castellano before 6 a.m. That Jenny had left her consulting position 8 months ago, that her LinkedIn profile had gone dark around the same time, and that the last traceable professional connection in her network before that disappearance was a firm called Viridian Strategic Partners, which was not a name Avery recognized, but which Priya, in her 7:03 a.m. message, confirmed was a known associate entity of Warren Holt's primary holding company. So that was the shape of it. Not a spontaneous decision by a desperate man, but something planned across months. A woman positioned in a social network adjacent to Avery's assistant. A setup constructed carefully enough that Priya had no reason to question it. A blind date engineered to place Avery Sinclair in a low-profile situation at an elevation that limited response options. Someone had looked at her schedule, her habits, her staff relationships, and her security protocols, and had built a trap that looked like a favor from a friend. The craftsmanship of it was almost impressive, in the way that certain kinds of damage were almost impressive before you fully reckoned with what they'd cost. Special Agent Dana Reyes from the Denver field office was 40, precise, and had the kind of eyes that processed information and gave very little back. She took Avery's statement in one of the resort's conference rooms with a recorder and a partner named Cho, who said almost nothing and wrote almost everything. Reyes asked good questions. Not the broad, open-ended kind that invited narrative, but the surgical kind that targeted specific gaps and inconsistencies, the kind that told you the person asking had done significant homework before walking into the room. "Warren Holt," Reyes said, at one point, in the tone of someone confirming a suspicion rather than testing one. "He's who I'd look at first," Avery said. "We're looking," Reyes said, which was all she said about it. The interview ran 90 minutes. At the end, Reyes gave Avery a card and said that the investigation would move quickly given the number of actors involved and the organized nature of the operation. and that Avery should expect subpoenas related to the contract dispute as part of the broader evidence picture. Avery said she'd have her legal team cooperate fully. Reyes said she expected nothing less, in a tone that suggested she meant it as both instruction and assessment. Cole's interview ran separately, in a different room, with different agents. Avery knew this because she'd seen him go in. Still in the dry shirt from the night before, his left arm in a proper sling. Now that the stitches had been cleaned and dressed at the resort's first aid station, Mason installed in the East Wing common room with a resort staff member named Patricia, who had apparently decided that Mason was her personal project for the morning and was currently teaching him to play gin rummy with a seriousness that suggested she believed he could be made competitive before noon. Avery had checked on Mason twice. The second time, Mason had looked up from his cards and said, "I'm winning," with the factual certainty of someone reporting weather. Patricia had mouthed, "He is from across the table." Cole came out of his interview at 10:40. He found Avery in the corridor outside, sitting on a bench with her phone, her own phone, restored to full function once her account credentials had been remotely verified through her security firm's protocol, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How was it?" she asked. "Thorough," he said. "They know what they're doing." "Reyes?" "Different team, a man named Ferris." He looked at his sling. "He had questions about my background." "Your Navy background." "My specific Navy background," Cole said, "which is the kind of thing that gets attention in federal interviews when it becomes relevant." He said it without particular anxiety, but also without the careful blankness of someone pretending they had no feelings about it. "Some of what I did is still classified. Ferris knows the framework for that. It'll get routed to the right people." "Are you worried?" He thought about it honestly. "About the legal exposure from last night?" "No. The actions were proportionate to the threat. There are multiple witnesses, and the alternative outcomes were significantly worse for everyone involved." He paused. "About having my file pulled and reviewed by people who haven't seen it in 3 years? A little. Not because of what's in it, because it's mine, and I left it behind when I left, and having it in a room again feels like—" He stopped. "Like a door you closed opening back up," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah." She understood this in the specific way of someone who had also, at various points, deliberately closed doors. The Garrett situation. The business partner who'd gone to Portugal. The version of herself at 23 who'd thought success was a destination rather than a condition you maintained at significant ongoing personal cost. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you did last night is going to be in that file too. Now." He hadn't considered that framing, she could tell. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "I suppose it is," he said. Priya called at 11. Not a text, a call, which meant the information was too complex or too significant to compress into a message. Avery answered and put it on speaker because Cole was there, and because the pretense of information compartmentalization had ended somewhere around the time she'd stepped in front of a weapon on a mountain ridge. "Viridian Strategic Partners," Priya said, in the voice she used when she'd found something real. "It's a shell entity, not Warren Holt directly, but traceable to him through 2 holding companies and a partnership agreement filed in Delaware 18 months ago. The connection to Jenny Castellano is through a man named Rick Four, who is listed as a Viridian consultant and who is Jenny's boyfriend as of 10 months ago." A pause. "I found a photo of them together at an event in Chicago. I also found that Rick Four has a prior federal charge, fraud, 2019, reduced to a misdemeanor, and that his LinkedIn lists his specialty as competitive intelligence and stakeholder mapping, which is the kind of job description that means something specific when the employer is a shell entity." Avery looked at Cole. Cole was listening with the same focused stillness he brought to everything. "So Four seeded Jenny," Avery said, "used the relationship to access her network, identified Priya as an entry point, and built the setup from there." "That's what it looks like," Priya said. "Jenny may not have known what she was part of, or she knew pieces without knowing the whole." A pause. "I've already sent everything to your legal team. They're packaging it for the FBI contact by noon." "Good," Avery said. "Send Reyes a direct copy too, so her card is in my email. You have access."
Already drafted, Priya said. One more thing. Her voice shifted. Warren Holt's company filed for a 30-day extension on the federal contract bid yesterday afternoon, before any of this became public, which means either he knew something was about to change his competitive position, or he expected me to be unavailable this morning, Avery said. The sentence sat in the corridor between them like something physical. Yeah, Priya said quietly. Send everything, Avery said. Legal Reyes and flag it for the Contract Oversight Office at the federal level. They need to know a bid extension was filed by a party under investigation. Done by noon, Priya said. And then softer. Avery, are you actually okay? She thought about the honest answer. The wool socks in the snow, the folding knife she'd held with intent and no practice, the man on the ridge, and the instinct that had put her body between him and Mason before she'd thought about it. I'm recalibrating, she said, which is different from not okay. Priya was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. That's good. They ended the call. Cole had been looking at the far wall during the call, giving her the conversational space without removing himself from it, and she appreciated the calibration of that. He looked at her now. It'll move fast from here, he said. Yes. She put the phone in her pocket. The federal piece usually does when the evidence is this organized. They have 11 people in custody. At least 2 of them will cooperate to reduce their exposure. Holt's insulation through the shell entities is good, but not airtight. It never is when there are this many people who can talk. She paused. He'll probably have counsel arguing for a deal within 6 weeks. And the contract bid? Void, once the federal investigation is formal. Sinclair Tech's bid stands on its own merits. She said it without triumph, just fact. The contract felt smaller this morning than it had 12 hours ago, which was an interesting recalibration. It was still $900 million and 5 years of infrastructure work that mattered. It was just no longer the largest thing she was thinking about. Cole nodded slowly. I should find Mason, he said. We need to figure out the drive back to Durango. His school doesn't know he missed. He stopped, seemed to register the absurdity of the sentence. His school doesn't know he missed. In the context of everything preceding it, something in his face loosened slightly. He's going to tell this story for the rest of his life. He should, Avery said. He earned it. Cole stood. He looked at her for a moment, that particular full attention look that she'd stopped being surprised by and started looking forward to, which was its own piece of information about where things stood. The jacket, he said. She was still wearing it. She'd put it on this morning when she'd gone to the business center, without thinking about it, the same automatic comfort of a thing that had been useful. She took it off and held it out. He took it. Their hands were in contact for approximately 2 seconds during the transfer. Neither of them made it a moment. It was just 2 seconds, which was plenty. Cole, she said. He waited. I'd like to come see the workshop, she said, in Durango. If that's something you'd be open to. He looked at her. She kept her expression level because she was not someone who performed vulnerability easily, and she was already out at the edge of her comfort on this one. Yes, he said. Simple. No conditions on it. I have things to clear in San Francisco first, she said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll be there, he said. I'm always there. She understood that he meant both the workshop and the larger truth of it. That Cole Maddox was a man who stayed where he said he'd be, who built things that lasted because he showed up for them every day, who had told his son that scared meant you were paying attention and then demonstrated for him, repeatedly, what you did with that attention. She had been paying attention, finally. She thought it might be the most useful thing she'd done all evening. He went to find Mason. She watched him go down the corridor, the sling slightly awkward, the flannel jacket back on his shoulders. At the corner, he ran into Patricia, who had apparently escorted Mason partway before releasing him, and Mason attached himself to his father's good side and looked up and said something that made Cole stop walking and look at his son with an expression she was too far away to fully read. She turned and walked toward the lobby. The drive back down the mountain was arranged by the state police, a convoy of resort guests being transported to the valley in shifts, their vehicles either following or being retrieved later depending on condition. The 2 black vans had been impounded. The parking lot was considerably less populated than it had been at 2 a.m.
the organized chaos of law enforcement having compressed into the quieter, more administrative aftermath. Avery's car was in the lower lot. Fine. She confirmed this with the deputy coordinating the vehicle releases, collected her keys, and sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes without starting the engine. She called her board chair. Gerald Fitch was 71 years old and had been in technology finance for 40 of those years, and had the particular quality of stillness that came from having seen multiple cycles of crisis and recovery. He listened to her account of the evening without interrupting, which was the thing she'd always valued most about him. The genuine listening, without agenda, without the impulse to reframe before she'd finished. When she was done, he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. A man named Cole Maddox made sure of that. "Who is he?" She thought about how to answer that. "Someone I underestimated," she said, and then stopped underestimating. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "The contract investigation will be formal within the week," he said. "I'll brief the board today. We'll hold on any public statement until the FBI advises. Your legal team will coordinate." "Yes." "Avery." A pause. "Take a few days. I have the Singapore call." "I'll handle the Singapore call," he said. It was so rare for Gerald to override her on scheduling that the offer landed with real weight. "Take a few days? This is not optional, and I say that as someone who has been telling you to slow down for 11 months and watching you not do it." His voice was not unkind. "Something happened to you last night that is going to take time to process, whether you choose to process it or not. The work will be here. Give yourself the time." She started to argue and found she didn't have it in her. "Okay," she said. "Good," he said, and ended the call before she could revise. She started the car. The road down the mountain was cleared, salted, the day's thin winter sun doing minimal work on the remaining ice, but enough. She drove carefully and let the landscape move past her. The pine forest, the exposed ridgeline, the distant valley coming into view as the road descended. Somewhere in this mountain she had run barefoot through snow and held a pressure bandage on a man's arm and stepped in front of a weapon she had no capacity to stop. She had not known she was capable of the third thing. That was the part she kept coming back to in the quiet of the drive. Not the fear. She'd known about the fear, had always been aware of it as a background condition she managed, not the crisis competence. She'd demonstrated that in boardrooms and product failures and the vendor contract disaster of 2 years ago. The third thing was different, the reflex that had no calculation in it. The body going before the mind had run the numbers. She thought about what Cole had said on the ridge. Instinct comes from character. She'd turned it over several times since then, testing it for the kind of comfortable-sounding falseness that passed for wisdom in keynote addresses and came apart under pressure. It didn't come apart. It held. She thought about the kind of character that produced certain reflexes, and what that said about what you'd been doing, quietly, in the background of yourself, while you were busy building something else. She thought she might have been building something she hadn't been paying attention to. Durango was 4 hours from Black Ridge on a good road day. She knew this because she looked it up on her phone at a gas station halfway down the mountain, with no particular plan attached to the knowing. She drove to her hotel in Vail. She'd booked 2 nights following the conference, the kind of optimistic booking that conference schedules always invited and she almost never honored. And she checked in and she slept for 6 hours in the middle of the day for the first time in longer than she could accurately recall. She did not check her email when she woke up. She sat by the window and looked at the mountain light going gold on the snow, and she thought about a workshop in Durango that she had never seen and was already curious about. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, she drove the 4 hours. She'd looked the address up through Cole's business website, which was a single-page thing with photographs of his work and a contact email, and no particular effort at impression management, the kind of website that existed because you needed one rather than because you wanted people to find it impressive. The photographs were enough. Furniture with the specific quality of things that had been thought about before they were made, joints that were tight, surfaces that were honest about their material. She'd sent him a text the night before, "Coming tomorrow, if that works." And he'd replied, "It works." The workshop was attached to a small house on the east side of Durango, off a residential street where the houses had yards, and the yards had evidence of actual use. A basketball hoop, a garden box,
a truck with a dented rear panel parked in a driveway. The workshop itself was separate from the house, connected by a covered walkway, a medium-sized structure with wide doors currently open to the December air and the sound of something being worked from inside. She parked and sat in the car for a moment. She was nervous, which she found interesting. She'd presented to rooms of 500 people. She'd negotiated against rooms of lawyers. She'd spent a night on a mountain in December with armed men in the trees, and she'd been frightened, but she'd been functional. This was different. The specific nervousness of arriving somewhere that mattered to you before you'd confirmed it was safe to let it matter. She got out of the car. The workshop smelled like sawdust and wood oil and something faintly resinous, the smell of a space that was used daily for a thing its occupant understood. Cole was at the bench in the center of the room, planing the edge of a board with a hand plane, his back to the door, his left arm still moving carefully but moving. The stitches out, she knew, because he'd mentioned it in one of the texts. He heard her come in. He turned. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, a different one from the dinner, equally worn. There was sawdust on his forearms and in the crease of his wrist. He looked like a man who was completely at home in the space he was standing in, which was a quality she'd been thinking about since the mountain. This specific ease of being in a place you'd built for yourself. "You found it," he said. "Your website has a map," she said. "I know, Mason insisted." He set the plane down on the bench. He said a business with no map was unprofessional. She looked around the workshop. There were 3 pieces in various stages of completion: a dining table near the far wall, a cabinet frame against the back, something smaller on a side bench that might have been a chair. The walls had tools organized with the same economy of space she'd seen in How He Moved. A place for everything, nothing decorative about it, just the clean logic of a person who'd decided what mattered and arranged accordingly. "It's good," she said. He looked at the space with her. "It's what I have," he said. "Yeah." She looked at him. "That's not what I meant." She meant the furniture, the work, the specific quality of attention visible in things made by someone who cared about what they were making. "It's genuinely good." He accepted this without deflecting, which she appreciated. Mason appeared from the covered walkway in a rush. School day finished, backpack still on, and the kind of momentum a child built up over 8 hours of enforced stillness. He pulled up short when he saw Avery, and his face did a quick inventory of surprise and recognition and something that was plainly pleased. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. Mason looked at his father and then back at Avery with the frank assessment of a child who has decided to take a situation seriously. "Are you staying for dinner?" "Mason," Cole said. "I'm asking," Mason said without apology. Avery looked at Cole. Cole's expression was caught between the resigned exasperation of a parent whose child has committed a social overstep and something that was willing to let it land. "If it's not an imposition," Avery said. "It's not," Cole said. Mason dropped his backpack by the workshop door and went into the house through the walkway, with the particular urgency of a child who has decided the situation is handled and has moved on to the next thing. Cole looked at Avery. "He's been asking since Blackridge when you were coming," he said. "I told him I didn't know." "What did he say?" "He said you'd come." Cole picked up the hand plane again, turned it in his hands. "He said you were the kind of person who did what you said." She thought about a 7-year-old who kept napkin drawings as evidence that things had been real, who had learned, from the specific losses of his particular childhood, to watch carefully for whether things and people were what they presented themselves to be, who had watched her for approximately 4 hours and arrived at a conclusion. She thought about whether she deserved that conclusion and decided that the honest answer was, not yet, maybe, but working on it. She sat down on a stool near the workbench. Cole went back to the plane, the long, slow strokes of it against the board's edge, the thin curl of wood peeling away. "I have a proposition," she said. He didn't stop working. "Okay." "The Sinclair Foundation," she said. "It's been running for 4 years. Technology access, education, some affordable housing work that's been underfunded because I haven't given it enough attention." She paused. "I want to build something more serious on the housing side.
specifically for military families and veterans, people who've spent years moving, who've never had the resources to put down roots, who come out the other end of service and find that the civilian housing market has no category for them. The plane made its long stroke. Cole was listening. "I need someone to run the construction side," she said. "Not manage a budget, but actually run it. Someone who understands both what military families need and what quality building looks like. Someone with credibility in both rooms." She kept her voice even. "I'm not offering it because of what happened at Blackridge. I'm offering it because you're qualified for it, and it's real work that needs doing, and I would have gotten here eventually, even if the evening had been boring." Cole set the plane down. He looked at the board in front of him for a moment, then at her. "That's a big offer," he said. "It's a serious proposition," she said. "There's a difference. A big offer is me writing a check. This is me asking you to build something." He looked at her steadily. "I have a workshop. I have clients who depend on my timeline. I have Mason's school. The foundation's housing work is primarily in Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah," she said. "Durango is centrally located. The work would be field work, not desk work. Your schedule, your oversight model." She paused. "Mason's school stays the same." He was quiet. "I need one condition," he said. "Tell me." "That the project is measured by the families it actually serves, not the press it generates." He held her gaze. "I've seen enough things get built for the announcement rather than for the use. If this is going to be real, the metric is real." She looked at him. "I was going to say that myself," she said. "That's already the condition." He looked at the workshop around him, the table in progress, the cabinet frame, the chair on the side bench. The space he'd built for himself in Durango as the opposite of everything operational, the deliberate small life. She watched him look at it and understood what she was asking him to consider. Not to leave it, but to expand the radius of it. To take what he'd built in the quiet and bring it to bear on something larger. Not because larger was better, but because the specific thing he'd built himself into was exactly the thing that the work required. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's fair," she said. "Give me a week." "Take 2, she said. "The foundation's not going anywhere." He nodded. He picked up the plane again and went back to the board, and she sat on the stool and watched him work. The long strokes, the curl of wood, the unhurried competence of a man doing something he understood. It was quiet in the workshop in the particular way of spaces where real work happened. Not empty quiet, but occupied quiet. The kind that had texture and substance and didn't need filling. She had spent 11 months filling every quiet she found with another task, another call, another email, another optimization of something that was already running adequately. She had done it because the quiet was where the other things lived. The Garrett situation, the empty second bedroom, the question of what she was building her company toward and who she was building it with, and whether success was a direction or a destination, and what was on the other side of it. She sat in Cole's workshop and did not fill the quiet. She let it be what it was. Dinner was pasta and a salad that Cole made from what was in the refrigerator, which was not a production but was competent and sufficient in the same way everything he did was competent and sufficient, and Mason sat at the table and described to Avery in considerable detail the gin-rummy game he'd played with Patricia at the resort and the 3 strategic errors he'd identified in retrospect. "You were 7 hours out from a crisis situation and you were doing strategic retrospective on a card game," Avery said. "I was processing," Mason said, with the dignity of someone using a vocabulary he'd acquired from a specific source. Cole looked at his plate. "Your dad taught you that word," Avery said. "He says when something hard happens, you have 2 choices," Mason said. "You can carry it around unexamined, or you can look at it and figure out what it means." He picked up his fork. "He says the second one is harder, but it makes you lighter in the long run." Avery looked at Cole. "He's paraphrasing," Cole said. "He's accurate," she said. Cole met her eyes for a moment. Something passed between them that wasn't a conversation exactly, but had the weight of one. After dinner, she helped Mason with the dishes, which he treated as a collaborative project with an established protocol that she was expected to learn and follow. She learned it. He corrected her twice on the drying technique, and she accepted the corrections without irony. He seemed satisfied. She left at 8:30 because Mason had school in the morning and because there was a version of overstaying that she was disciplined enough to recognize. Cole walked her to her car. The street was quiet. Residential December evening, a neighbor's porch light, the sound of something from a television somewhere inside a house down the block. The air was cold, but not the mountain cold of Blackridge, just the ordinary cold of a Colorado town in December, which was the version that didn't carry the specific weight of what she'd run through barefoot. She opened the car door. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "The date," she said. "Before all of it." He looked at her. "I'd like to do it again," she said. "The part before all of it. Minus the elk medallions because you and Mason were both right. They were overcooked." Something moved in his face, the almost smile, which she had learned to read well enough now that it no longer looked like almost anything. It was his version of the thing fully expressed. "The salmon wasn't that good either," he said. "Then we'll find somewhere better," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the porch light from across the street. This woman who had driven 4 hours on a Tuesday and sat on a stool in his workshop and argued for real metrics on an affordable housing initiative and dried dishes to Mason's specifications, and whatever he was thinking about her, she didn't know the specifics of it, but she knew the quality of the looking. "Yeah," he said. "We will." She got in the car. She drove out of Durango with the heater running and the radio on low and the mountains visible in the rearview mirror, blue, dark, and permanent and completely indifferent to anything that had happened on their slopes 3 weeks ago or would happen in the years ahead. They'd been there before any of it, and would be there long after, which was either a sobering thought or a freeing one depending on what you did with the time in between. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved the way Avery had said it would, quickly and with accumulating weight. Warren Holt's counsel reached out to the federal prosecutors by the end of the 5th week, which was a week earlier than Avery had estimated. Rick Farr cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, and his account confirmed the engineering of the blind date setup in detail, including the Della Marsh alias that had never connected to a real person and the manufactured introduction through Jenny Castellano, who had been genuinely unknowing and who Priya called personally once the legal situation had been clarified enough to allow it, because Priya was the kind of person who understood that the people caught in the machinery of a thing they hadn't understood deserved more than a legal clearance letter. The federal contract went through formal review. Sinclair Tech's bid was evaluated on its merits by a new oversight panel, and 3 months after the mountain, Avery got the call she'd been working toward for 18 months. She took it in her office in San Francisco, sitting at her desk, and when Priya knocked and put her head around the door and saw Avery's expression, Priya said yes, and Avery said yes, and Priya made a sound that rattled the glass in the doorframe. Avery called Gerald Fitch. She called her legal team. She sent a brief message to the board. Then she called Cole. He picked up on the 3rd ring. There was a sound in the background that she'd learned to identify, the hiss of a circular saw, the kind of workshop noise that meant he was in the middle of something and had answered anyway. "You got it," he said, before she could speak. "How did you know?" "You sound like you sound when something is resolved," he said. "You get quieter." She hadn't known that about herself. She sat with it for a moment. "I got it," she said. "Congratulations," he said. "Simple, genuine, no performance." "Cole." "Yeah." "I'm going to need a construction director for the Veterans Housing Initiative," she said. "I know I said 2 weeks. It's been 11. A pause. The saw sound in the background stopped. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "I know." "Mason asked me last week if I was going to say yes," he said. "He said he thought I should." "What did you tell him?" "That it was my decision." A pause. He said that was fair, but that his opinion was yes. She smiled. She was looking out the window at the San Francisco afternoon, the bay in the distance, gray and familiar. She thought about a 7-year-old who delivered his opinions with the gravity of a professional consultant and kept his evidence folded in his hoodie pocket. "And your opinion?" she said. A silence that wasn't empty. "Yes," Cole said. She exhaled, not dramatically, just the particular exhale of something that had been held and was now set down. "There's a project in Grand Junction that needs a site visit next month," she said. 15 units for veteran families. The builder is good, but the oversight has been weak. I need someone on the ground who can look at it and tell me what's actually there. Send me the address, he said. She did, that afternoon, along with the project files and the contractor assessments and everything her team had compiled. He called her back that evening with 4 specific questions about the structural reports that her site manager had not thought to ask, and she answered them, and then they talked for 40 minutes about something else entirely, the way they'd been talking in the months since Durango, in the particular easy circuit of 2 people who had learned each other quickly under pressure and were now learning each other slowly in the ordinary days. It was not a perfect thing. Avery still checked her phone too much, and Cole still held parts of himself at a measured distance from fully letting things in, and Mason had strong opinions about everything that occasionally required diplomatic navigation. The 4 hours between San Francisco and Durango were 4 real hours that had to be managed around real schedules. None of it arranged itself cleanly, but there was something underneath the imperfection that held, something that had been built, not assumed, out of a night on a mountain and the slow accumulating evidence of who each of them actually was when the situation required it. Avery had learned that December in Colorado that the most important thing she would ever build would not be built from metrics and optimization and the disciplined pursuit of a defined objective. They would be built the way Cole built furniture, one piece at a time, with attention to the joint, with honesty about the material, with the particular patience of someone who understood that a thing made well took as long as it took and arrived, eventually, as something that could bear weight. She'd also learned that being scared meant you were paying attention, and that what you did with that attention was the whole of it. Cole had built a quiet life on the other side of something enormous, and he'd done it with the same care and honesty he brought to everything, and he'd raised a son who kept his drawings safe and said thank you to people who were worth noticing, and told his father that both things could be true at the same time. They could. That was the part she kept coming back to in the end. Not the kidnapping, not the mountain, not the 11 armed men in a parking lot, or the 7 stitches, or the night air and the stars above a cleared ridge. Not the contract, or the investigation, or the verdict that would eventually come down in a federal courtroom that she would attend and testify in and leave without looking back. What she kept was the truth that both things were possible simultaneously, that she could be successful and present, ambitious and human, someone who built companies, and also someone who sat still on a stool in a workshop and listened to the sound of wood being worked, that she could check her exits and still stay. That was the thing the evening had given her, not a rescue, a recalibration. And Mason, who had drawn his helicopter with great seriousness and tucked the evidence into his pocket for safekeeping, who had told her that the helicopter won because it could fly away, Mason had gotten something wrong, she thought. Sometimes the thing worth having was exactly where you were. Sometimes you didn't need to fly away. Sometimes you landed.